The flames rose like vengeful spirits against the night sky, turning the Wyoming darkness into a hellish inferno. Inside the Whispering Pines mine, the screams of trapped men echoed through smoke-filled tunnels as timber supports cracked and gave way. Outside, rain pelted down steam rising where water met fire, creating a ghostly veil around the catastrophe. Rachel Hayes struggled against her brother's iron grip. "Let me go, Mason. There are still people inside." "It's too late." Mason's voice broke as he wrestled his sister back from the mine entrance. The heat singed his eyebrows, scorched his lungs with each desperate breath. "The main shaft is collapsing." A deafening crack split the air as the entrance caved in, sending a plume of sparks skyward. Rachel went limp in his arms, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "No, no," she whispered. Mason didn't see the second explosion coming. One moment he was holding his sister. The next, a force like God's own fist slammed into them. He flew backward, his world dissolving into darkness and pain. When consciousness returned, Mason found himself staring at stars partially obscured by smoke. His ears rang. Blood trickled down his face. He called his sister's name, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. No answer came. Staggering to his feet, Mason searched frantically through the chaos of shouting men and flickering shadows. When he found her, Rachel lay motionless near the collapsed entrance, her golden hair spread across the mud. Her blue dress, the one she'd been so proud of, now stained with soot and blood. She didn't respond when he called her name. She didn't move when he cradled her against his chest. The light in her eyes, the fierce, determined light that had defined her, was gone. As the mine burned behind him, and the rain washed down upon them both, Mason Hayes howled his grief into the uncaring Wyoming night. 5 years later, Mason Hayes stood before a simple headstone, his tall frame silhouetted against the setting sun. Wind whispered through the pines surrounding the small plot of land where his sister rested. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair beginning to gray at the temples despite his 30 years. "It's been 5 years, Rachel," he said, voice low and rough. "Years of questions. 5 years of nightmares." He knelt and placed a bouquet of wildflowers, the kind Rachel had loved, against the gray stone. From his pocket, he withdrew a small piece of charred fabric, rubbing it between calloused fingers. "I'm close now. The Mercers think they're untouchable, but I've found a way." His jaw tightened. "They sent men to warn me off last month. That tells me I'm on the right track." Rain began to fall gentle at first, then heavier. Mason didn't move, letting it soak through his duster, plastering his hair to his forehead. In the distance, thunder rumbled. "I'll find the truth," he whispered, clutching the burned fabric, the last remnant of Rachel's blue dress. "I swear it on everything I am. I'll find the truth and make them pay." He remained there in the downpour, a solitary figure bent under the weight of an oath and memory, as lightning flashed across the darkening Wyoming sky. The Mercer family mansion stood like a monument to wealth and power against the rolling landscape of Wyoming territory. Built of imported stone and local timber, it rose 3 stories high with windows that gleamed like gold in the afternoon sunlight. A testament to what ambition could achieve in this still wild country. Inside its oak-paneled study, Joseph Mercer's voice cut through the air like a whip. "This contract is binding, Mr. Torres. Your mark is on the paper." Across from him stood a weather-beaten farmer hat clutched in rough hands, desperation etched into the lines of his face. "But, Senor, I did not understand about the water rights. My family needs the creek. Without it, you'll need to dig a well." Joseph's steel-gray eyes showed no emotion. At 58, His imposing frame remained unbent by age, his beard neatly trimmed his suit, impeccable despite the frontier setting. "That's not my concern, Father." The single word spoken softly from the doorway caused both men to turn. Abigail Mercer stood with a ledger in her hands, her simple blue dress a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding her. At 23, she was the youngest of the Mercer daughters, with chestnut hair pulled back in a practical style and eyes the color of Wyoming sky in autumn. "Abigail, we're in the middle of business." Joseph's tone carried warning. She entered anyway, moving to stand beside the farmer. "I've been reviewing the contracts, and there's an issue with this one." She opened the ledger, pointing to a specific entry. This clause about water rights was added after Mr. Torres signed the initial agreement. "See the difference in ink color, and this isn't his handwriting." Joseph's face darkened. "That's enough." "No, it isn't." Abigail's voice remained, even though her hands trembled slightly. "This contract diverts the creek entirely to our new cattle operation. It would leave the Torres family without water for their crops or livestock. They've farmed that land for 15 years. "Gracias, señorita," the farmer whispered, hope kindling in his eyes. Joseph stood his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Mr. Torres was compensated fairly for the land. For the land, yes. Not for the water. He didn't know he was signing away. Abigail met her father's glare without flinching. "This contract has a hidden clause, Father. We cannot take away their only water source." For a long moment, silence hung in the room. Then Joseph's lips pressed into a thin line. "Mr. Torres, you may go. We'll review the matter." The dismissal was curt. After the farmer left, with profuse thanks to Abigail, Joseph closed the study door with deliberate calm. When he turned to face his daughter, his expression had hardened into stone. "You've cost this family a considerable advantage, Abigail." "I've prevented this family from committing fraud," she corrected, closing the ledger. Again, Joseph moved to the window, looking out over the vast Mercer Holdings land that stretched to the horizon, purchased through similar negotiations over the years. "You don't understand what it takes to build something lasting in this territory." His voice held a dangerous quiet. "Your grandfather came here with nothing. I've turned that nothing into an empire." "At what cost?" Abigail asked. "The Torres family would have starved by next summer." Joseph turned his gaze, piercing. "Business isn't the place for sentiment. Remember that tonight when you join us for dinner." It wasn't a request, but a command. The Mercer dining room glowed with lamplight reflecting off crystal and silver. At the long mahogany table, the family gathered in strained silence. Joseph sat at the head, carving the roast with precise movements. Eleanor Mercer, his wife of 35 years, sat to his right, elegant in dark green silk, her once blonde hair now streaked with gray, but styled impeccably. To Joseph's left sat Victoria, the eldest daughter, at 30 sharp-eyed and ambitious, dressed in the latest fashion from back east. Beside her was Sophia, 27, whose delicate features and practiced smile masked a calculating mind. She twirled the engagement ring on her finger, a diamond from the governor's son that caught the light with each movement. Abigail sat farthest from her father, acutely aware of the distance, both physical and emotional, that separated them. "I heard about your interference with the Torres contract," Victoria said, breaking the silence as she accepted a slice of meat from her father. "That water access would have doubled the value of our southern pastures." "The contract was altered after signing," Abigail replied, keeping her voice even. "That's fraud, Victoria." "It's business," Sophia interjected, her tone sweet, but eyes cold. Father needs that water for the new cattle drive. The governor's office is counting on our support for the railroad initiative. Eleanor's fork paused halfway to her lips. Perhaps we could divert only part of the creek. She offered the compromise tentatively. Leave enough for the Torres farm. Joseph's knife clinked sharply against his plate. The matter is closed. It always is when someone questions your methods, Abigail said quietly. The silence that followed felt brittle enough to shatter. Joseph continued eating as if he hadn't heard, though the muscle ticking in his jaw betrayed his anger. Do you know what they call you in town, Abigail? Sophia finally asked, her perfect smile never wavering. The Mercer conscience. As if the rest of us have none. Sophia, Eleanor cautioned. It's true, Mother. She undermines Father's business at every opportunity. The Henderson contract last year, Judge Morrison's nephew before that, and now the Torres water rights. Sophia's smile tightened. You've been a burden long enough. Enough! Eleanor's voice held uncharacteristic sharpness. Victoria patted her napkin to her lips. Sophia's tactless, but she's not wrong. Your constant interference has consequences, Abigail. Real consequences for this family's future. And what of the consequences for others? Abigail asked. Does that factor into your calculations at all? Before anyone could answer Miller, the family butler entered with a silver drum. A letter for you, for Mercer, he announced, presenting the envelope with practiced formality. Joseph examined the wax seal, his expression changing subtly. He murmured, breaking the seal and unfolding the letter. The name sent a chill through Abigail, though she couldn't say why. Joseph read in silence, then refolded the paper with deliberate movements. It seems Mason Hayes is seeking a wife. Victoria raised an eyebrow. The reclusive rancher I thought he never socialized. He owns half the Northern Valley, Sophia said with sudden interest. They say he's turned that old homestead into something impressive. Joseph's gaze settled on Abigail, a calculating look that made her stomach tighten. He specifically inquires about the youngest Mercer daughter. All eyes turned to Abigail, who set down her fork with forced calm. I don't understand. I've never spoken with Mr. Hayes. A smile spread across Joseph's face, not one of warmth, but of opportunity recognized. Nevertheless, he's asked for you by name. We'll discuss this after dinner, in my study. The meal continued, but Abigail barely tasted the food. Something in her father's expression had shifted like a predator sensing an unexpected advantage. The Hayes name tugged at her memory, something about a mine accident years ago, something her father had been unusually quiet about. She didn't know then how that letter would change everything, how it would unearth secrets long buried like bones rising from shallow graves after heavy rain. Later that night, with the household settling into silence, Abigail lingered in the hallway outside her father's study. The door stood slightly ajar, voices drifting through the gap. She hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but hearing her name held her rooted to the spot. It's perfect timing, Joseph was saying. Hayes wants a bride, and we need to remove Abigail before she causes more damage. She's still your daughter. Eleanor's voice sounded strained. A daughter who's cost us the Henderson contract, the Morrison connection, and now the Torres water rights. A glass clinked against wood. Do you know what that water access was worth, Eleanor? Thousands. And she gave it away out of misplaced sentiment. Victoria's voice now. Are you certain Hayes can be trusted? He's been asking questions about the mine incident. Abigail's breath caught. The mine incident. Whispering Pines. The tragedy that had claimed 12 lives 5 years ago. All the more reason to give him what he wants, Joseph replied. Keep your enemies close. Isn't that what they say? Better to have him focused on a new bride than digging through old history. It seems cruel, Eleanor whispered, using Abigail this way. Joseph laughed a sound without humor. Cruel, it's practical. Hayes gets the wife he inexplicably asked for, and we solve our Abigail problem in one stroke. Sending her away will solve two problems at once. Hayes will be busy with his new wife, and we won't have to worry about her questions about old documents anymore. And if she refuses, Sophia's voice now practical as ever. She won't. Joseph's tone hardened. She's been a burden long enough. She'll do as she's told for once. Abigail backed away silently, heart pounding against her ribs. A burden. A problem to be solved. The words cut deeper than they should have, familiar as they were after years of similar sentiments. She slipped through the darkened house to her room, mind racing. Mason Hayes, the reclusive rancher whose property bordered the old Whispering Pines mine. The man who'd lost his sister in the accident, if the gossip was to be believed. Why would he ask for her specifically? They'd never formally met, though something tugged at her memory. A fleeting encounter years ago, perhaps. As she sat at her window watching moonlight silver the landscape, Abigail made a decision. If her father wanted to send her away as a solution to his problem, she would go. Not because she was obedient, but because anything, even marriage to a stranger, would be better than remaining in this beautiful prison where truth was the enemy and profits the only morality that mattered. What she didn't yet realize was that she wasn't the only one with hidden motives in this arrangement. Mason Hayes sat in his study, watching shadows from the fireplace dance across the wooden floor. The lamp on his desk cast enough light for him to see the photograph he held Rachel in her blue dress, laughing at something off-camera, her eyes bright with life. He traced the outline of her face with his thumb, remembering. "I've set it in motion, Rach," he whispered to the empty room. "The letter was delivered today." And on his desk lay papers spread in careful order, newspaper clippings about the Whispering Pines disaster, labeled diagrams of the mine shafts, and testimonies he'd gathered from survivors, those willing to speak at least. Many weren't not when the Mercer name was involved. The mine had been declared unsafe by Inspector Franklin weeks before the explosion. That report had mysteriously disappeared from county records. 2 days after the tragedy, Joseph Mercer had purchased the land at a fraction of its value from the devastated original owners. Within a month, all investigations into the cause of the fire had been quietly closed. 12 dead, including Rachel. No accountability, no justice. Until now. Mason picked up another photograph, this one showing a young woman helping an elderly man with his fallen groceries in town, unaware she was being observed. Abigail Mercer, the youngest daughter. The one who'd exposed the Henderson land fraud. The one who'd spoken up about Judge Morrison's nephew's corruption. The one they called the Mercer conscience. He remembered the first time he'd seen her 3 years ago at the county fair. A crowd had gathered around the horse auction where a wealthy merchant was attempting to handle a struggling old stallion. The man's crop had come down repeatedly on the animal's flanks, raising welts, while onlookers laughed. Except one. A young woman in a simple blue dress had pushed through the crowd and placed herself between the horse and its tormentor. "He's in pain," she'd insisted, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "Can't you see the infection in his hoof? He's not being stubborn. He's suffering." The crowd had laughed. The merchant had sneered. Then Joseph Mercer appeared, pulling his daughter away with harsh whispers about embarrassing the family. But before she was led away, the young woman had met Mason's eyes across the crowd. A brief connection, a recognition of shared values in a world that often lacked them. That day, Mason saw in Abigail Mercer the same spirit that had animated his sister, a determination to stand for what was right, regardless of consequences. It had kindled something in him beyond his quest for justice, hope that perhaps not all Mercers were cut from Joseph's cloth. Now, she would become his path to the truth. Through her, he would finally uncover what really happened at Whispering Pines, what role her father had played in the disaster that took Rachel and 11 others. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was using Abigail, just as her family was using her as a pawn in a larger game. The knowledge sat like acid in his stomach. Mason set the photograph down and moved to the window. Outside, pine trees swayed in the night breeze, their silhouettes black against the star-filled sky. His ranch spread below, a testament to 5 years of relentless work, building something meaningful from grief's ashes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though whether to Rachel's memory or to Abigail Mercer, he couldn't have said. The truth demanded its price. He only hoped he could pay it without losing what remained of his soul. The next morning, Joseph summoned Abigail to his study. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air as she entered. Her father stood by his desk, Mason Hayes's letter in hand. Expression unreadable. "You wanted to see me," Abigail said, remaining near the door. Joseph gestured to a chair. "Sit." She complied, folding her hands in her lap to hide their slight trembling. She'd barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities and plans. "Mason Hayes has written with an unusual request." Joseph began tapping the letter against his palm. "He seeks a wife and has expressed interest in you specifically." Abigail kept her expression neutral. "Why me? We've never been formally introduced." "He mentioned seeing you at various town events and being impressed by your character." The pause suggested Joseph found the notion ridiculous. "He's built something substantial out of that old Hayes property. 2,000 acres, good cattle stock, a respectable house. And you wish me to accept his proposal?" Not a question. Joseph's eyes narrowed slightly at her tone. "I do. The match would be advantageous for all involved." "All involved meaning the Mercer family business," Abigail clarified. A muscle twitched in Joseph's jaw. "Don't play naive, Abigail. It doesn't suit you. You're 23, unmarried, with a reputation for difficult behavior. Hayes is offering a respectable name and comfortable situation. Many would consider it a fortunate match." Abigail thought of the conversation she'd overheard. A way to be rid of the family problem. A way to silence questions about old documents. "When would this marriage take place?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. "Hayes suggests next week. He'll send a carriage Thursday." So soon. Her heart quickened. "May I know more about him, his character, his expectations?" Joseph waved a dismissive hand. "He's considered honest in his dealings. Keeps to himself mostly. Built that ranch from nearly nothing after his sister died in the mine accident." Something flickered across Joseph's face at the mention of the mine. A shadow quickly suppressed. Abigail caught it, filing the reaction away. "And if I refuse?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Joseph set the letter down precisely on his desk. "You won't." His voice held iron certainty. "You've caused enough difficulty for this family. It's time you contributed something other than problems." The words shouldn't have hurt after years of similar sentiments, yet they still found their mark. Abigail rose, gathering her dignity. "Very well. I accept Mr. Hayes's proposal." Joseph's surprise at her ready agreement was almost worth the ache in her chest. Good. Your mother will help you prepare. You'll leave Thursday morning. As Abigail turned to go, he added, one more thing. Hayes mentioned something about journals or record books. He seems to think you might have an interest in historical documents. You wouldn't happen to have been examining any of the old company ledgers, would you? The question carried danger. Abigail kept her face carefully blank. Only the current contracts, Father. As you've seen. He studied her for a long moment. See that it stays that way. The past is better left undisturbed. As she left the study, Abigail's mind raced. Hayes was interested in historical documents. The connection to the mine disaster crystallized more clearly. Whatever game her father was playing by sending her to Mason Hayes, it seemed Hayes might be playing one of his own. For the first time in years, she felt something beyond the dull resignation that had become her constant companion curiosity, and perhaps a dangerous flicker of hope. In the fading light of late afternoon, Eleanor Mercer found her youngest daughter in the garden, sitting on a stone bench beneath the old oak tree. Abigail had a book open in her lap, but her gaze was fixed on the distant mountains, thoughts clearly elsewhere. "May I join you?" Eleanor asked softly. Abigail looked up, a flash of surprise crossing her features before she nodded. Her mother rarely sought her out these days, a distance having grown between them as Abigail's conflicts with Joseph intensified. Eleanor settled beside her daughter, smoothing her skirts with practiced grace. At 56, she remained beautiful, though lines of worry had etched themselves around her eyes and mouth over the years. "Your father tells me you've accepted Mr. Hayes's proposal," she began. "Did I have a choice?" Abigail couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. Eleanor sighed, her gaze falling to her hands where they rested in her lap. Once those hands had played piano beautifully, had braided Abigail's hair, had wiped away childish tears. Now they seemed perpetually tensed, as if bracing against an unseen force. "We always have choices, Abigail, though sometimes none of them are what we might wish." The wind rustled through the oak leaves above them, casting shifting patterns of shadow across the garden. "Do you know Mason Hayes' mother?" Abigail asked. "Have you met him?" "Once at the Founders' Day celebration 2 years ago. He seemed thoughtful, quiet." Eleanor hesitated. There was a depth to him, a seriousness beyond his years, because of his sister, the one who died in the mine. Eleanor's fingers twitched almost imperceptibly. "Yes, Rachel was her name. She was about your age when it happened. What caused the explosion? I remember it was ruled an accident, but it's best not to dwell on tragedies, Abigail." Eleanor's interruption came too quickly. "What's done is done." The familiar evasion. Abigail had encountered it all her life whenever she approached topics the family deemed unsuitable. A wall of silence built from propriety and secrets. "I'm to marry a man I barely know in a week, Mother." Abigail closed her book with deliberate care. "A man who lost his sister in a mine your husband bought immediately afterward. Don't you think I deserve some truth before I'm sent away?" Eleanor stood abruptly, moving to a nearby rosebush. She touched a bloom with trembling fingers, her back to her daughter. "Truth is rarely simple, Abigail." Her voice had dropped to nearly a whisper. "Sometimes knowing doesn't bring the peace you think it will. I'd rather painful truth than comfortable lies." Eleanor turned, something shifting in her expression. For a moment, she looked younger, more like the mother Abigail remembered from childhood, the one who had read her stories and taught her the names of wildflowers. "You always were different from your sisters." A sad smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Victoria embraced your father's ambition, Sophia his social aspirations, but you have my father's inconvenient integrity." Abigail blinked in surprise. She'd rarely heard her mother speak of her own family. Your grandfather believed that wealth created obligation, not privilege. Eleanor continued, her gaze distant with memory. He built his fortune, then used it to help others build theirs. When he died, many said Wyoming territory lost its conscience. Her eyes refocused on Abigail. I see him in you. Perhaps that's why. She trailed off, composing herself with visible effort. Why what, mother? Why it's been difficult. For all of us. Eleanor reached out, touching Abigail's cheek with cool fingers. Pack your journal. And that book of medicinal herbs your grandmother gave you. Mason Hayes lives simply, but they say his land is beautiful. Perhaps you'll find something there you haven't found here. Peace, purpose, acceptance. The unspoken possibilities hung between them. I should go help Miller with the dinner arrangements, Eleanor said, withdrawing her hand. As she turned to leave, she hesitated. Abigail, be careful with questions about the mine. Some answers come at great cost. Before Abigail could respond, her mother was gone, a pale figure moving through the lengthening shadows toward the house. Left alone, Abigail opened her book again, but instead of reading, she slipped out a folded paper hidden between the pages, a newspaper clipping about the Whispering Pines disaster. 12 dead investigation ongoing. Joseph Mercer purchasing the land for future development. What answers might be waiting at Mason Hayes's ranch? And what would they cost? The setting sun painted the garden in amber light as Abigail tucked the clipping away, determination hardening within her. If her family thought sending her to Mason Hayes would silence her questions, they would discover just how wrong they were. The night before Abigail's departure, while the Mercer household slept, Victoria silently opened the door to her sister's room. Moonlight spilled across the floor as she entered, finding Abigail still awake, folding clothes into a small trunk. I thought you might be packing, Victoria said softly, closing the door behind her. Abigail glanced up, surprise flickering across her features. The sisters had grown increasingly distant over the years, Victoria aligning herself with their father's business interests, while Abigail questioned them. It's late, Abigail observed, continuing to fold a simple blue dress. Victoria moved deeper into the room, elegant even in her nightgown, her blonde hair braided for sleep. She picked up a book from Abigail's bedside table, examining it with a raised eyebrow. Medicinal herbs, planning to become a country healer, as well as a rancher's wife. Grandmother believed in being prepared. Abigail took the book gently from her sister's hands. Did you need something, Victoria? The eldest Mercer daughter sighed, her practiced composure slipping momentarily. I came to see if you're really going through with this, marrying a man you don't know. As if I have a choice. Abigail placed the book in her trunk. Father's made it clear I'm to go. You always have a choice, Abby. Victoria used the childhood nickname that had faded from use years ago. You could refuse, create a scandal. It wouldn't be the first time. Abigail studied her sister, trying to discern her true purpose. And what would that accomplish besides father's wrath? No, this way is better. A clean break. Victoria moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. Hayes is not what he seems, you know. The statement hung in the air, sharp as broken glass. What do you mean? He's been asking questions about the mine, about father's business dealings. Victoria turned her face half in shadow. He's not just looking for a bride, Abigail. He's looking for something else. Abigail set down the shawl she'd been folding. And father knows this, yet he's still sending me to him. Father thinks he's being clever, giving Hayes what he wants, while keeping him where we can see him. A hint of bitterness crept into Victoria's voice. using you as both distraction and spy. And what do you think? Abigail asked carefully. Victoria was silent for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. I think there are things about this family you don't know. Things better left buried. Like what happened at Whispering Pines. The name caused Victoria to stiffen almost imperceptibly. Be careful, Abigail. Mason Hayes lost his sister in that accident. His interest in you may not be as innocent as a marriage proposal suggests. And Father's willingness to send me to him is not as simple as getting rid of a problematic daughter, Abigail countered. Tell me what you know, Victoria. Please. For a moment, it seemed Victoria might actually answer. Then her expression closed, the familiar Mercer mask sliding back into place. Just be careful, she said finally, and if you find yourself in trouble, send word. Despite everything, you're still my sister. She moved to leave, but Abigail caught her arm. Victoria, wait. What aren't you telling me? The eldest Mercer daughter hesitated at the door. Mother is more fragile than she appears, she said cryptically. Remember that. With that, she slipped out, leaving Abigail alone with more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that her departure from the Mercer home was entangled in something far more complex than a convenient marriage. Thursday dawned clear and cool, the Wyoming sky a vault of perfect blue, stretching from horizon to horizon. By mid-morning, Abigail's small trunk was loaded onto the waiting carriage, her goodbyes said, with varying degrees of sincerity. Joseph Mercer's farewell was perfunctory, a reminder of her duties as a wife, and the importance of maintaining the Mercer name with dignity. Sophia offered a kiss on the cheek that didn't reach her eyes, while Victoria remained oddly silent, her gaze communicating unspoken warnings. Only Eleanor lingered by the carriage, reaching for her daughter's hand one last time. Remember who you are, she whispered, pressing something into Abigail's palm. Not just a Mercer, but my daughter too. When Abigail opened her hand, she found a small silver locket, her mother's worn since before Abigail was born. Inside was a miniature portrait of Eleanor's father, the grandfather Abigail had never met. Mother, I can't. You can, and you will. Eleanor closed Abigail's fingers around the locket. Some legacies are worth protecting. Before Abigail could respond, Joseph called impatiently from the porch. Eleanor squeezed her daughter's hand once more, then stepped back, her face composing into its usual mask of serene detachment. As the carriage pulled away, Abigail watched her family grow smaller against the imposing backdrop of the Mercer mansion. Joseph stood rigid, Victoria beside him with arms crossed. Sophia had already gone inside. Only Eleanor remained watching until the carriage crested the hill and the house disappeared from view. Abigail turned forward, the silver locket cool against her skin, where she'd fastened it around her neck. Whatever awaited her at Mason Hayes's ranch, she was leaving behind a lifetime of careful silences and calculated cruelties. The thought brought both terror and a surprising sense of liberation. The journey to Pine Ridge Ranch would take most of the day. As the carriage rattled over increasingly remote trails, Abigail found her thoughts returning to the first and only time she'd seen Mason Hayes up close. The county fair 3 years ago. The horse auction. She'd been unable to stand by while the merchant beat the poor animal for its inability to walk on an infected hoof. Her intervention had earned her father's fury and public humiliation. But there had been one face in the crowd that didn't mock or judge a tall man with serious eyes who'd nodded slightly when she spoke up for the suffering creature. Later, she'd learned his name from town gossip Mason Hayes, the reclusive rancher who'd lost his sister in the Whispering Pines tragedy. Now, she was traveling to become his wife. The thought should have terrified her more than it did. From her satchel, Abigail withdrew a small leather-bound journal, her private record of Mercer family business dealings that had struck her as suspicious over the years. Hidden among mundane observations and pressed flowers were careful notes about altered contracts, mysterious payments, and properties acquired under questionable circumstances, including the purchase of Whispering Pines Mine. If Mason Hayes sought information about her family's business practices, he would find in Abigail both a valuable source and a willing ally. Not out of disloyalty to her family name, but out of loyalty to the truth, a distinction her father had never understood. The carriage crested a rise, and suddenly the landscape opened before her. Pine Ridge Ranch spread across the valley below, a patchwork of green pastures bordered by stands of tall pines that gave the property its name. A river snaked through the eastern section, catching the afternoon light like a ribbon of gold. In the center stood a substantial log house, larger than she'd expected, with smoke rising from the chimney and corrals visible nearby. It was beautiful, in a way the Mercer estate, for all its grandeur, was not honest and unadorned, working in harmony with the land, rather than imposing upon it. As the carriage began its descent into the valley, Abigail tucked her journal away and straightened her simple blue traveling dress. Whatever game her father was playing by sending her here, whatever Mason Hayes sought by requesting her as a bride, she had her own purpose now. The truth about Whispering Pines lay somewhere on this property, and Abigail Mercer was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. Mason Hayes stood on his porch as the carriage wound its way down the valley road toward his ranch house. The setting sun cast long shadows across the land, painting everything in hues of gold and amber. He'd spent the morning in a state of controlled tension, checking and rechecking preparations, questioning his own plan with increasing frequency. Was he doing the right thing, bringing Abigail Mercer here under such pretenses? Using her to get to her father, the question had plagued him for weeks since he'd sent the letter. But each time doubt crept in, he would take out the charred fabric from Rachel's dress, and resolve would harden anew. 12 lives, no justice. Some debts could only be paid in truth. The carriage drew closer, dust rising behind its wheels. Mason straightened his collar one last time and stepped down from the porch. He'd made an effort with his appearance. Clean-shaven hair trimmed his best shirt and vest. Not out of vanity, but respect. Whatever else this arrangement entailed, Abigail Mercer deserved dignity. When the carriage finally stopped before him, Mason found himself unexpectedly nervous. He'd seen Abigail from a distance many times over the years, observed her quietly during his investigations, but having her here on his property about to become his wife in name, if not in truth, it carried a weight he hadn't fully anticipated. The driver opened the carriage door and helped Abigail step down. She wore a simple blue traveling dress, her chestnut hair pinned back, practically a small silver locket at her throat, catching the dying sunlight. She looked younger than he remembered, more vulnerable somehow, though her eyes, when they met his, held steady determination. "Miss Mercer," Mason said, stepping forward and removing his hat. "Welcome to Pine Ridge." "Mr. Hayes," her voice was clear and calm, betraying no fear despite the circumstances. An awkward silence stretched between them, filled with unasked questions and unspoken truths. "Your trunk," Mason finally said, gesturing to where the driver was unloading a modest case. "Is that all you've brought?" "I travel light, Mr. Hayes." A hint of challenge in her tone. "I hope that won't be a problem." "Not at all." He found himself appreciating her directness. "My sister was the same way." At the mention of Rachel, something flickered in Abigail's eyes, recognition perhaps, or wariness. "I've prepared dinner," Mason said, gesturing toward the house. "You must be hungry after your journey." "That's very thoughtful. Thank you." He paid the driver, who tipped his hat, and turned the carriage around for the long journey back to town. As the sound of hooves and wheels faded into the distance, Mason became acutely aware that they were alone now, two strangers bound by secrets neither was ready to share. He carried her trunk into the house, Abigail following a few steps behind. Inside, the main room welcomed them with warm lamplight and the aroma of cooking. Mason had built the ranch house himself, expanding the original cabin into something substantial but not ostentatious. Sturdy furniture, clean lines, and an unexpected wall of bookshelves filled with volumes on every subject. Abigail paused at the sight of the books, surprise evident in her expression. "You have quite a library, Mr. Hayes." "Books are good company on winter nights," he replied, setting down her trunk. "The bedroom's through there. It was my mother's room before she passed. I've been using the loft." He didn't mention that he'd spent days preparing the room for her arrival, airing out linens, fixing the loose floorboard, even finding a vase for wildflowers that now sat on the small dresser. "I'll show you where everything is after we eat," he continued, moving toward the kitchen. "Unless you'd prefer to rest first. No dinner would be welcome." Abigail remained standing in the center of the room, taking in her surroundings with careful attention. "Your home is lovely." "Not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Mason asked, curious despite himself. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "My father described a crude cabin and difficult circumstances. He seemed to relish the idea." The casual cruelty of Joseph Mercer revealed in a single sentence. Mason's jaw tightened. "Your father doesn't know my home," he said simply. "Or me. I'm beginning to think that's true of many things regarding my father." Abigail's gaze met his directly. "Including why he was so eager to send me to you, Mr. Hayes." The directness of her statement caught Mason off guard. He'd expected evasion, perhaps tears or recrimination. Not this calm assessment of the situation. "Please call me Mason," he said, buying time to consider his response. "If we're to be married, formality seems unnecessary." "Are we to be married, Mason?" She emphasized his name slightly. "Or is this arrangement something else entirely?" In the kitchen, the pot on the stove began to boil over, saving him from an immediate answer. He turned away to deal with the small crisis, aware of Abigail watching him, her perceptiveness far more dangerous than he'd anticipated. Joseph Mercer had sent his daughter away to silence her questions and remove a problem. But in doing so, he might have made the gravest miscalculation of all. Because Abigail Mercer, it seemed, was not a woman easily silenced. And the question she brought with her to Pine Ridge Ranch might uncover truths even Mason Hayes wasn't prepared to face. The stew simmered on Mason's stove, filling the cabin with a rich, comforting aroma. He ladled generous portions into 2 bowls, then sliced fresh bread baked that morning in nervous anticipation. Across the small kitchen table, Abigail sat straight-backed, but with hands clasped tightly in her lap, betraying her tension. "It's nothing fancy," Mason said, placing a bowl before her. "But it's filling." "Thank you." She breathed in the steam rising from the bowl. "It smells wonderful." They ate in silence for several minutes, the clink of spoons against bowls the only sound. Through the window, darkness had fully descended, transforming the glass into a black mirror, reflecting their awkward tableau. "Your father's letter said very little about you personally," Mason finally said, breaking the silence. "Only that you were practical." A small, humorless smile touched Abigail's lips. "Practical. That's kind." "Is it?" "It's my father's way of saying unremarkable." She met his gaze directly. "Or troublesome, depending on his mood." Mason set down his spoon. "I remember you from the county fair 3 years ago." Surprise flickered across her face. You stopped that merchant from beating his horse, he continued. You tore strips from your petticoat to wrap its infected hoof while your family told you to leave it alone. Color rose in Abigail's cheeks. You remember that? I remember thinking that anyone who would ruin her dress to help a suffering animal was someone worth knowing better. He paused, his expression growing more serious. I also remember how quickly your family hurried you away, as if kindness was something to be ashamed of. Something shifted in Abigail's eyes, a wariness giving way to cautious curiosity. Is that why you wrote to my father? She asked. Why our family specifically? Mason was quiet for a long moment, weighing truth against strategy. Because I've been looking for someone real, he said finally. Someone who sees the world as it actually is, rather than as others would have them see it. And you think that's me, based on one encounter with an injured horse, based on that and other things I've observed. He held her gaze. Your reputation precedes you, Abigail, the mercer who speaks up when others won't, who questions what others accept. She set down her spoon, appetite apparently forgotten. My reputation as the family embarrassment, you mean? Your reputation as someone with integrity, a rare quality in these parts. Abigail studied him with those perceptive eyes, clearly trying to reconcile his words with whatever expectations she'd brought to Pine Ridge. You still haven't answered my question from earlier, she said. Are we truly to be married, or does this arrangement serve some other purpose? Mason rose and moved to the window, looking out at the night. The moon had risen, casting silver light across his land. In its pale illumination, the distant pine ridge that gave his ranch its name stood like sentinels against the sky. Marriage was the simplest way to bring you here without raising questions, he admitted. But I won't hold you to it if that's not what you want. What I want, genuine surprise, colored her voice. No one has asked me that in a very long time, Mr. Hayes. Mason, he corrected gently. And I'm asking now. Abigail was silent for so long that he turned from the window to find her staring into the depths of her stew as if searching for answers there. What I want, she said slowly, is the truth. About why you brought me here. About what happened at Whispering Pines. About my father's involvement. The directness of her response shouldn't have surprised him yet. It did. Joseph Mercer's daughter was nothing like her father. No evasions, no calculated manipulations. The truth, he echoed. It can be a dangerous thing, Abigail. So I've been told my entire life. She looked up at him, chin raised slightly in defiance. Yet, I find lies far more dangerous in the long run. Mason returned to the table sitting across from her. The lamplight caught the silver locket at her throat, reminding him that whatever game was being played, Abigail was not merely a pawn, but a person with her own history, her own wounds. I did bring you here with ulterior motives, he confessed. I've been investigating the Whispering Pines disaster for 5 years. Your father's company owned the mine. After the explosion, crucial safety reports disappeared. The investigation was shut down prematurely. And my sister died, he added softly. Abigail's expression softened with genuine sympathy. Rachel, she said. My mother mentioned her name. Mason nodded, throat suddenly tight. She was 22, same age as you are now. I'm sorry for your loss. The simple words carried weight, because he could see she truly meant them. I thought perhaps you might have information, Mason continued, or access to documents that could help me understand what really happened. Why 12 people died in a mine that should have been closed for safety violations. Understanding dawned in Abigail's eyes. So that's why my father was so eager to send me away. He thinks I've been looking through old company records. Have you? A shadow of a smile touched her lips. More than he knows. She reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a small leather-bound journal, placing it on the table between them. I've been recording inconsistencies in my father's business dealings for years, including, she opened to a specific page, the purchase of Whispering Pines Mine for 1/10 its assessed value, just days after the explosion. Mason stared at the journal, hardly daring to believe what she was offering. You've been investigating your own father. I've been seeking the truth. Abigail closed the journal. Just as you have. The realization struck him forcefully. He had expected to manipulate information from Joseph Mercer's daughter, perhaps playing on her naivety or resentment. Instead, he'd found an ally who'd been fighting the same battle but from inside enemy territory. Your father doesn't know about this, he said, gesturing to the journal. If he did, I wouldn't be here. I'd be locked in my room or shipped off to some distant relative. Her voice was matter-of-fact. My father values his empire above all else, including truth, including family. Why risk it? Why keep records that could destroy your own family? Abigail touched the silver locket at her throat, a gesture that seemed unconscious. Because some legacies are worth protecting, and they're not measured in acres or dollars. The simple dignity in her response left Mason momentarily speechless. He had planned for so many contingencies in bringing Abigail Mercer to his home: tears, anger manipulation, even seduction attempts. But he hadn't planned for straightforward honesty and shared purpose. It seems we both want the same thing, he said finally. Justice for those who died at Whispering Pines. Abigail nodded. Including your sister? Yes. Then perhaps this arrangement can work after all, Mr. Hayes. She offered her hand across the table. Partners in truth-seeking, if not husband and wife. Mason took her hand, noting the surprising strength in her grip. Partners, he agreed. Only later, alone in the loft, while Abigail settled into his mother's old room, did Mason confront the unexpected twist in his plans. He had brought Joseph Mercer's daughter to Pine Ridge as a means to an end, a way to access information, perhaps even leverage against her father. Instead, he had found someone whose quest for truth matched his own. Someone whose quiet courage reminded him painfully of Rachel. Someone who, despite everything, he was beginning to respect far more than he had anticipated. The complication was unwelcome. Justice required clear vision unclouded by personal feelings. Yet, as moonlight filtered through the loft window, Mason found himself wondering if perhaps there might be room for both justice for the past and something new for the future. Rachel would have liked Abigail, he thought, as sleep finally claimed him. And that, more than anything, felt like a sign he might be on the right path after all. Dawn broke over Pine Ridge in layers of gold, and rose sunlight spilling across the valley floor and climbing the pine-covered slopes beyond. Abigail woke to unfamiliar surroundings. A simple room with handcrafted furniture, walls of unvarnished pine logs, and a window that framed a view more breathtaking than any painting in the Mercer mansion. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. Then memory returned: the carriage ride, Mason Hayes, their conversation over stew, and the unexpected alliance they had formed. She rose and dressed quickly in one of her simple dresses, then moved to the window. Below, Mason was already at work in the corral, his tall figure easily recognizable as he moved among the horses with confident ease. Something about the sight, a man working his own land with his own hands, struck Abigail as deeply honest in a way her father's empire of ledgers and contracts never had been. When she emerged from the house minutes later, Mason looked up from brushing down a chestnut mare, surprise evident on his face. "You're up early," he said. "I'm used to early mornings." Abigail approached the corral fence, though usually with books, not horses. "This is Penny," Mason said, patting the mare's neck. "Gentlest horse on the ranch. If you'd like to ride while you're here, she'd be a good match." "I'd like that." Abigail smiled, extending a hand palm up for the horse to investigate. "Though I should warn you, my riding lessons were more concerned with appearing ladylike than with actually controlling the horse." A small smile touched Mason's lips, the first she'd seen. "Penny won't care how you look in the saddle, only that you're kind to her. Horses are good judges of character that way." The mare snuffled at Abigail's hand, then allowed her to stroke the soft muzzle. "What will the day bring, Mason, now that we've established our partnership?" He finished brushing the horse's flank before answering. "Chores first. A ranch doesn't run itself. Then I thought I'd show you the property if you're interested. Including," he added more quietly, "Whispering Pines." Abigail nodded, understanding the significance of the offer. "I'd like to see it. To understand." "After breakfast, then?" He hesitated. "Unless you'd prefer to rest today. The journey yesterday was long." "I didn't come here to rest, Mason." Her voice was gentle but firm. "I came for the truth, remember?" Something like admiration flickered in his eyes. "So you did." Over a breakfast of eggs and coffee, they developed a plan for the day ahead. Mason would handle the essential ranch work, then take Abigail to the old mine site. In the evening, they would begin comparing notes, her journal records, against his 5 years of investigation. "There's something else you should know," Mason said as they cleared the dishes together. "I've been meeting with former Inspector Franklin. He was forced into retirement after questioning the official report on Whispering Pines." "Where is he now?" "He has a small cabin near the northern edge of my property. We meet there sometimes to review evidence." Mason dried a plate with methodical care. "He's the one who told me the safety inspection report was altered before the disaster." "Altered how?" "Critical violations were removed. The mine should have been shut down weeks before the explosion." His hands stilled on the dish towel. 12 people would still be alive. The simple statement carried the weight of 5 years of grief. Abigail touched his arm briefly, a gesture of understanding rather than pity. "We'll find the truth, Mason. Together." He nodded, his expression resolute. "I'll finish my chores. Meet me by the barn in an hour." As Mason headed out to tend to his cattle, Abigail explored the ranch house more thoroughly. The bookshelves proved especially revealing volumes on mining engineering. Wyoming territorial law and investigative techniques stood alongside classic literature and practical guides to ranching and agriculture. One book in particular caught her attention, a collection of Wyoming folk medicine remarkably similar to her grandmother's book she'd packed in her trunk. Inside the front cover was an inscription in faded ink: "To my son Mason, healing comes in many forms. Find the one that brings you peace. Love, Mother." The personal touch humanized Mason Hayes in a way their conversations had not yet managed. This was not merely a man driven by vengeance, but someone raised with values of care and healing. Values his quest for justice might have temporarily overshadowed. When she met him at the barn an hour later, Abigail carried her grandmother's herbal medicine book, presenting it with a smile. "It seems we have more in common than just a pursuit of truth." Mason examined the familiar volume, surprise evident in his expression. "My mother had this same book. She was known locally for her remedies. My grandmother as well." Abigail reclaimed the book, tucking it into the small satchel she'd brought. "Perhaps truth-seeking runs in both our families, despite my father's best efforts." Something shifted in Mason's eyes, a softening that transformed his usual intensity. Perhaps it does. He helped her mount Penny, adjusting the stirrups with careful hands, then swung onto his own horse, a larger, more spirited gelding named Thunder. Side by side, they rode away from the ranch buildings and into the vast landscape beyond. The day was perfect for riding, clear blue sky, gentle breeze, carrying the scent of pine wildflowers nodding in meadows of knee-high grass. Under different circumstances, Abigail might have found it idyllic. But today's destination cast a shadow over the beauty surrounding them. As they rode, Mason pointed out landmarks, the creek that provided water for his cattle, the south meadow where he grew hay, the ridge of pines that marked his property's boundary. He spoke with quiet pride of what he'd built in the 5 years since Rachel's death, turning grief into something productive, something lasting. Abigail listened, noting how different this was from her father's boasting about the Mercer holdings. Joseph spoke of conquest, Mason of stewardship. "It's beautiful," she said truthfully. "You've created something meaningful here." "Some days it feels that way," he acknowledged. "Other days—" He trailed off his gaze, shifting toward the northern horizon, where a treeless patch marred the otherwise green landscape. Whispering pines. They rode in silence for another mile, the mood growing heavier with each step the horses took toward that barren spot. When they finally crested a gentle rise, Mason drew his horse to a halt, and Abigail did the same. Below them lay the remains of the mine. 5 years had done little to heal the scorched earth surrounding the collapsed entrance. A few blackened timbers still protruded from the ground, like broken bones. The stream that ran nearby curved conspicuously away from the site, as if nature itself wanted no part of the tragedy that had unfolded there. "This is where it happened," Mason said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. April 17th, 1880. Just after the night shift began. Abigail felt the weight of his words, each one carrying years of pain. "Rachel wasn't even supposed to be there," he continued, eyes fixed on the ruined mine entrance. "She'd come to bring me dinner during my shift. I was showing her the new support beams we'd installed when the first explosion happened." "You were inside?" Abigail couldn't mask her shock. Mason nodded unconsciously, touching a scar on his forearm. "I made it out with some burns. Rachel," his voice caught. "She was deeper in the tunnel. The second explosion sealed her fate." They dismounted, leaving the horses ground-tied as they approached the site on foot. Abigail followed Mason's lead, sensing that this pilgrimage was sacred to him, perhaps the first time he'd shared it with anyone. "The official report claimed it was a pocket of methane gas," Mason said as they stood before the collapsed entrance. "Natural and unavoidable. But you don't believe that." Inspector Franklin found evidence of substandard support beams, cheaper wood than regulations required, inadequate ventilation, missing safety equipment. Mason knelt, picking up a handful of the still blackened soil. All violations he'd documented weeks before in his report. A report that was altered before being filed. "By my father?" Abigail asked quietly. "By someone with the authority to do so." Mason let the soil filter through his fingers. "Your father bought this land for pennies on the dollar 2 days after the explosion. Had the investigation closed within a week. The implication hung between them as tangible as the scent of old ash that still lingered in the air." "Why would he want a failed mine?" Abigail asked, trying to make sense of it. "What value would it have?" Mason straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. "That's one of the questions I haven't answered yet. The mine itself wasn't particularly productive by most accounts. Yet your father wanted it badly enough to—" He trailed off. "To ensure no one looked too closely at what happened here." Abigail finished for him, the weight of her family's potential complicity settling on her shoulders. They stood in silence for several long moments, the Wyoming wind whispering through the pines that had given the mine its name. In that quiet, Abigail felt a shift within herself, a deepening resolve that went beyond intellectual curiosity or moral indignation. This was about human lives cut short, about a brother still grieving his sister. "There's something else I need to show you," Mason said finally. "Something I found last year that doesn't fit the official narrative." He led her around the collapsed mine entrance to a small clearing nearby. There, partially hidden by regrown underbrush, lay a rusted piece of metal machinery. "This is a blasting cap detonator," Mason explained, crouching beside it. "Used for controlled explosions in mining. But according to the official report, no blasting was scheduled for that day." Abigail knelt beside him, examining the corroded device. "You think the explosion wasn't an accident?" It wasn't a question, but Mason answered anyway. "I think someone wanted this mine destroyed. What I don't know is why." They spent another hour at the site, Mason pointing out inconsistencies between the physical evidence and the official report. By the time they remounted their horses for the ride back to the ranch, the sun had passed its zenith, and Abigail's mind was filled with troubling questions about her family's involvement. They rode in contemplative silence until the ranch buildings came into view. As they approached the barn, Abigail noticed a wagon parked near the house that hadn't been there when they left. "Were you expecting visitors?" she asked. Mason's expression darkened as he recognized the vehicle. "No, that's Dr. Wilson's wagon. He only comes out this way when there's trouble." They hurried the horses to the barn, quickly dismounting. As they approached the house, the front door opened and an elderly man with a medical bag emerged. His weathered face registered surprise at the sight of Abigail. "Ah, Mr. Hayes, I was just leaving you a note." The doctor's gaze lingered curiously on Abigail. "I wasn't aware you had company." "Dr. Wilson, this is Miss Abigail Mercer, my fiancée." Mason handled the introduction smoothly, though Abigail noticed his slight hesitation. "What brings you out this way?" The doctor's eyebrows rose at the name Mercer, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "It's Inspector Franklin. He took a bad fall last night. His neighbor found him this morning and fetched me. He's asking for you." Mason's posture stiffened. "How serious is it?" Dr. Wilson's expression was grave. "He's an old man, Mr. Hayes. The hip's broken badly. Fever's set in. He's lucid now, but—" He shook his head slightly.
"If there's anything you need to discuss with him, I wouldn't delay." "I'll go immediately." Mason turned to Abigail.
"I'm sorry, but I need to—" "I'm coming with you," she interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "If Inspector Franklin has information about Whispering Pines, I need to hear it too." Mason studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "We'll take the wagon. It's faster than riding." Dr. Wilson watched this exchange with evident curiosity. "I'll be checking on him again tomorrow morning," he said, climbing onto his own wagon. "Though I'm not sure—" He left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear. As the doctor's wagon pulled away, Mason quickly prepared their own transportation. Within minutes, they were heading north toward Franklin's cabin, the horses pushed to a pace that revealed Mason's urgency. "Franklin was the only official who questioned the mine report," he explained as they traveled. "Lost his position over it. He's been helping me piece together what really happened that day." "And you think his fall was an accident?" Abigail asked, noting the tension in Mason's jaw. "I don't know." His hands tightened on the reins. "But in my experience, there are no coincidences when it comes to Whispering Pines." The cabin appeared before them, a small, weathered structure nestled against the pine forest. Smoke rose thinly from its chimney, the only sign of habitation. Mason helped Abigail down from the wagon, his movements hurried but gentle. "He may be surprised to see you," Mason warned quietly, "especially once he learns your name." Abigail nodded her understanding. "I'm used to being judged by my family name, Mason. It won't be the first time." Inside the cabin was dim and smelled of medicinal herbs and wood smoke. On a narrow bed against the far wall lay an elderly man, his face gaunt, but his eyes sharp, despite the pain evident in their depths. He turned at their entrance recognition, lighting his features at the sight of Mason. "Hayes," he greeted, voice weaker than his gaze. "About time." "Dr. Wilson just found me," Mason explained, moving to the bedside. "What happened, Franklin?" The old man attempted to shift position, wincing at the movement. "Heard someone outside last night. Went to check. Next thing I know, I'm at the bottom of my own front steps with a busted hip." His gaze shifted to Abigail, narrowing suspiciously. "Who's this?" Mason hesitated only briefly. "Abigail Mercer. Joseph Mercer's daughter." Franklin's reaction was immediate. He tried to sit up, face contorting with pain and alarm. "Mercer, have you lost your mind, Hayes?" "After everything." "She's here to help," Mason interrupted firmly. "She's been keeping her own records of her father's questionable dealings, including Whispering Pines." The inspector subsided against his pillows, breathing heavily, eyes never leaving Abigail's face. "That true girl, you turning against your own blood." Abigail stepped forward, meeting his suspicious gaze directly. "I'm not turning against anyone, Mr. Franklin. I'm seeking the truth. If that truth implicates my father, then so be it." Franklin studied her for a long moment, then gave a short nod. "Might be I misjudged. Wouldn't be the first time." He gestured weakly to Mason. "The floorboard. Under the table. Get it." Mason moved to the rough-hewn table, kneeling to pry up a loose floorboard beneath. From the small hiding space, he withdrew a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Didn't know if they'd come back," Franklin explained, his breathing becoming more labored. "Needed to make sure that was safe." Mason unwrapped the bundle, revealing a leather folder containing papers. He opened it, eyes widening as he scanned the contents. "This is your original inspection report, the unaltered version." Franklin nodded weakly. "Kept a copy. Knew the official one would disappear." His gaze shifted back to Abigail. "Your father's signature is on the altered version, girl. Approving a mine he knew wasn't safe." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face, though some part of her had expected this revelation. "May I see it?" Mason handed her the folder. The report inside was detailed, listing numerous safety violations in Franklin's precise handwriting. In the margins were notes that had clearly been omitted from the official version, including warnings about the specific support beams that had failed during the explosion. On the last page was a notation that chilled her blood. "Second inspection denied by order of J. Mercer, despite continued safety concerns. Authorization given to continue operations without remediation." "He knew," Abigail whispered, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. "He knew and let it continue operating anyway." "Worse than that," Franklin said, his voice fading as fatigue overtook him. "There's more to it. The mine wasn't what they said. Tell her, Hayes." Mason took the folder from Abigail's hands, replacing it with a different document from the bundle, a geological survey. "Whispering Pines wasn't just a coal mine," he explained quietly. "This survey shows evidence of a gold seam that had been deliberately concealed in official records. A significant one." Gold. Abigail struggled to make sense of this new information. "But why hide it?" Franklin coughed weakly. Territorial taxes on gold mines are 4 times higher than coal, and mining rights revert to the territory if the original claim wasn't properly filed. Someone discovered the gold and wanted to keep it quiet until they could secure proper ownership. My father, Abigail said, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. He wanted the mine for the gold, not the coal. Franklin's eyes were closing, strength fading. There's one more thing. The night before the explosion, saw someone at the mine who shouldn't have been there, carrying blasting supplies. Couldn't make out the face, but he trailed off consciousness, slipping away. Mason checked his pulse with practiced fingers. He's still with us, he assured Abigail, just exhausted. They settled Franklin as comfortably as possible, stoking the fire and leaving water within reach. As they stepped outside into the late afternoon sunlight, Abigail felt as if a great weight had settled across her shoulders. If what he says is true, she said slowly, my father didn't just ignore safety violations. He may have been directly responsible for the explosion. Mason stared toward the distant outline of whispering pines, visible through the trees. I've suspected as much for some time, but suspicion isn't proof. The altered report is proof of negligence, at least. Abigail's mind raced through potential implications. Combined with the hasty land purchase afterward and the gold survey, it's circumstantial, enough to raise questions but not enough to prove deliberate destruction of the mine. Mason turned to face her, expression grave. And we still don't know who Franklin saw that night with the blasting supplies. The unspoken possibility hung between them that Joseph Mercer might have been directly involved in setting the explosions that killed 12 people, including Rachel Hayes. We need to compare these documents with my journal entries, Abigail said, professional detachment helping her maintain composure despite the devastating possibilities. And we need to find out who else might have been involved. As they climbed back into the wagon, Mason placed a hand briefly over hers, a gesture of support that acknowledged the difficult position these revelations put her in. Are you certain you want to continue with this, Abigail? If your father was involved in what happened at Whispering Pines, then he needs to face the consequences, she finished firmly. 12 families deserve to know what happened to their loved ones, including yours. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than their journey out, each lost in thought. The sun was setting by the time they arrived, painting the pine ridge in deep gold and casting long shadows across the valley floor. As Mason unhitched the horses, Abigail stood watching the fading light transform the landscape. The beauty of Pine Ridge Ranch stood in stark contrast to the ugly truths they were uncovering, a reminder that light and dark often existed side by side in this world. I'll prepare dinner, she offered when Mason joined her. You must have evening chores to attend to. He looked about to refuse, then nodded. Thank you. I won't be long. Alone in the kitchen, Abigail found simple ingredients and set about preparing a meal. The domestic task provided a welcome distraction from the troubling revelations of the day. She had known her father was capable of ruthlessness in business, had witnessed it firsthand many times. But the possibility that he had deliberately endangered lives for financial gain, that was a level of callousness she had not been prepared to confront. By the time Mason returned, she had a simple but satisfying meal ready. Cornbread beans with salt pork and fresh apples from the tree behind the house. This is unexpected, he said, washing up at the basin by the door. Thank you. My grandmother insisted all her granddaughters learn practical skills regardless of our social standing, Abigail explained, setting 2 plates on the table. Much to my mother's dismay. A small smile touched Mason's lips. Rachel was the same way. Could ride and shoot better than most men, but also made the best apple pie in the county. Used to say there was no point in being only half capable in life. And the casual mention of his sister, spoken with fondness rather than the usual pain, marked a shift in their relationship. The shared meal, following a day of difficult discoveries, created an unexpected intimacy between them. As darkness fell outside, they cleared the table and spread out their respective documents, Franklin's original report and survey, alongside Abigail's journal. Working together by lamplight, they began connecting pieces of the puzzle: dates, transactions, names that appeared in both sets of records. "Here," Abigail said, pointing to an entry from 3 weeks before the explosion. "My father met privately with Judge Morrison and a man named Garrett. The next day, $10,000 was withdrawn from the company account with no recorded purpose." Mason checked Franklin's notes. "That's the same day Franklin's revised report was filed, the one that omitted the safety violations." "And here?" Abigail turned a page. "A week after the explosion, my father transferred $20,000 to a numbered account. I could never trace where it went." "Payoffs," Mason suggested grimly, "to keep the investigation contained." They worked late into the night, piecing together a timeline that grew increasingly damning. By the time exhaustion forced them to stop, they had established a pattern of suspicious activities surrounding the mine disaster, all pointing toward Joseph Mercer's involvement. "We still don't have proof of who actually set the explosives," Mason said, rubbing his tired eyes. "But the circumstantial evidence is substantial." Abigail nodded wearily. "My father was in Denver the day of the explosion, according to my journal. He couldn't have placed the charges himself." "An accomplice, then." Mason gathered the documents, securing them in a lockbox. "Someone he trusted with such a dangerous task." As they prepared to retire for the night, an awkward awareness of their living arrangement resurfaced. Despite their growing partnership in investigation, they remained an unmarried man and woman sharing a home, a scandalous situation by societal standards. "I should check on the horses once more," Mason said, clearly offering her privacy to prepare for bed. "Mason," Abigail called as he reached the door. When he turned, she continued, "Thank you for trusting me today. With Franklin, with Rachel's story. I know it couldn't have been easy." He was silent for a moment, framed in the doorway. "You're not what I expected, Abigail Mercer." "Is that a good thing?" she asked, suddenly vulnerable. A genuine smile softened his features. "Yes, a very good thing." After he departed, Abigail prepared for bed in the simple room that had once belonged to his mother. Through the window she could see Mason moving between the barn and corral, a lantern casting his elongated shadow across the yard. She had come to Pine Ridge expecting manipulation, perhaps even danger. Instead, she had found unexpected honesty and a shared purpose. Whatever happened when their investigation concluded, whatever truths they uncovered about her father, Abigail realized she had found something valuable here. Respect based on who she was, not whose daughter she happened to be. That night, despite the troubling revelations about her family, Abigail slept more peacefully than she had in years. Mason rose before dawn, as was his habit, moving quietly through the still dark house to avoid waking Abigail. He stoked the kitchen fire and set coffee to boil, then stepped outside into the cool pre-dawn air. The stars still shone overhead, though the eastern horizon showed the first hint of approaching day. Mason breathed deeply, letting the pine-scented air clear his mind. Yesterday's discoveries had confirmed his worst suspicions about Joseph Mercer's involvement in the mine disaster, yet they still lacked the final piece, the identity of whoever had actually set the explosives. As he tended to the morning chores, Mason found himself thinking not only of Rachel and Justice, but increasingly of Abigail. Her courage in facing uncomfortable truths about her father. Her sharp mind as they pieced together evidence, her simple kindness in preparing dinner after an emotionally draining day, all had affected him more deeply than he'd anticipated. When he returned to the house, the aroma of coffee filled the kitchen, and Abigail stood by the stove already dressed for the day, in a simple blue dress, her hair neatly braided. "Good morning," she greeted, pouring coffee into 2 cups. "I hope you don't mind. I found eggs and decided to make breakfast." "Not at all." Mason accepted the offered cup gratefully. "You're up early." "Old habits." She turned back to the stove where eggs sizzled in a cast-iron pan. "My grandmother believed rising with the sun built character. My sisters always complained, but I came to treasure those quiet morning hours." As they shared the simple breakfast, Mason found himself studying Abigail with new eyes. The morning light through the windows caught the auburn highlights in her chestnut hair, softened the determination in her expression. In another life, under different circumstances, he pushed the thought away. They had more urgent matters to address. "I'd like to ride to town today," he said, refocusing on their investigation. "Check if Dr. Wilson needs anything for Franklin, and see if the newspaper office has archives about the mine purchase." "I'll come with you," Abigail offered immediately. Mason hesitated. People will talk. A Mercer staying at Hayes Ranch is bound to raise eyebrows. "Let them talk," she replied with a slight shrug. "We have more important concerns than gossip." Her pragmatism brought a smile to his lips. "Very well, but we should have a consistent story about your presence here." "The truth, then, or part of it?" Abigail sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "We're engaged to be married, getting to know one another before the ceremony. Nothing unusual in that, except perhaps the speed of the arrangement." "And if we encounter anyone connected to your family?" Mason asked. A shadow crossed Abigail's face. "That's unlikely. My father's associates avoid Silver Creek whenever possible, too small and unimportant for their business interests." They finished breakfast and prepared for the trip to town. As Abigail donned her hat and gloves, small concessions to propriety, Mason found himself wondering how different this day might have been had their circumstances been ordinary, a genuine courtship, rather than an alliance built on shared pursuit of justice. The ride to Silver Creek took just over an hour, the small town coming into view as they crested a hill overlooking the valley. Unlike the grand county seat where the Mercers conducted their business, Silver Creek was a modest settlement serving the surrounding ranches and farms, a single street of wooden buildings, a church with a white steeple and scattered homes radiating outward. They drew curious glances as they rode side by side into town, though the residents of Silver Creek were generally too polite or too cautious to stare openly. Mason guided their horses toward the small building that served as both doctor's office and pharmacy. Dr. Wilson was just returning from a house call, his medical bag in hand. He raised his eyebrows at the sight of them together. "Mr. Hayes, Miss Mercer, how is Inspector Franklin this morning?" "We were coming to ask you the same question," Mason replied, dismounting and helping Abigail down from her horse. "Have you seen him?" The doctor's expression grew somber. "I have. The fever's worse, I'm afraid. I've done what I can with the medicines available to us out here, but at his age—" He shook his head slightly. "Is there anything from the city that might help?" Abigail asked. "I could wire for specific medications if needed." Dr. Wilson regarded her with mild surprise, clearly not expecting such an offer from a Mercer. "That's very kind, Miss Mercer, but I fear time is the greater concern now, not medicines." "How much time?" Mason asked quietly. "Days, perhaps. A week, at most." The doctor's clinical detachment softened slightly. "I'm sorry, Hayes. I know he's been a friend to you." After arranging to send supplies out to Franklin's cabin, they continued to the newspaper office, a small, cluttered space that smelled of ink and dust. The editor, a balding man named Parker, looked up from his printing press in surprise. "Mason Hayes, haven't seen you in town for months." His curious gaze shifted to Abigail. "And with company, no less." "Miss Abigail Mercer," Mason introduced her. "My fiancée." Parker's eyebrows shot toward his receding hairline. "Mercer, as in Joseph Mercer's daughter?" "The same," Abigail confirmed with a polite smile. "Well, I'll be—" The editor seemed momentarily speechless, a rare condition for a newspaper man. "That's certainly unexpected." "We'd like to look at your archives," Mason said, steering the conversation away from their relationship. "Specifically, articles about the Whispering Pines disaster from 5 years ago." Parker's expression sobered immediately. "Research for the anniversary memorial, is it, that's coming up next month?" Mason nodded, accepting the convenient assumption. "Something like that. Files are in the back room," Parker said, gesturing toward a door behind his desk. "Organized by year and month. Help yourselves. I need to finish setting this type for tomorrow's edition anyway." The back room was barely larger than a closet walls, lined with shelves of bound newspapers and loose clippings. A small table with a single chair occupied most of the floor space. Mason closed the door behind them, providing what privacy the cramped quarters allowed. "The explosion was April 1880, he said, scanning the shelves. "Those volumes should be here." They worked methodically, Mason pulling down the relevant volumes, while Abigail reviewed the articles, making notes in a small book she'd brought. The initial coverage was extensive lists of the dead and injured accounts, from survivors, speculation about causes. But within 2 weeks the stories dwindled to almost nothing, replaced by news of Joseph Mercer's purchase of the property and vague references to future development. "Look at this," Abigail said, pointing to a small article from a week after the disaster. "The county coroner ruled all deaths accidental before the investigation was even completed. That's unusually quick." Mason leaned over her shoulder to read the short notice. "And here Judge Morrison signed off on the final report, the same Morrison who met with your father just before the explosion." "There's something else." Abigail turned to an even smaller item almost hidden at the bottom of a page. "This mentions a witness who claimed to have seen unusual activity at the mine the night before the explosion, but there was no follow-up in subsequent issues." Mason frowned, reading the brief paragraph. "No name given for the witness." "Franklin," Abigail suggested. "Possibly. Or someone who was silenced afterward." They continued searching, finding scattered references that taken individually seemed innocuous, but together painted a picture of a hastily closed investigation and suspicious circumstances. "Here's the land transfer notice," Abigail said, pointing to a legal notice 2 weeks after the explosion. "Whispering Pines properties sold to Mercer Mining Company for—" "This can't be right," Mason read over her shoulder. $500 for the entire claim. That's less than the value of the equipment alone, even damaged." "The owners were the Buchanan family," Abigail noted. "I don't recognize the name." "Jacob Buchanan was killed in the explosion," Mason explained grimly. "His widow would have been desperate for any income with 3 young children to support." Abigail's expression darkened. "So my father not only acquired a gold mine under the guise of a coal operation, but he took advantage of a grieving widow to get it at a fraction of its value. After possibly being responsible for her husband's death," Mason added softly. The weight of these revelations settled heavily in the small room. Abigail closed the volume slowly, her hands trembling slightly. "I knew my father was ruthless in business," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I've witnessed his questionable ethics firsthand. But this is beyond anything I imagined." Mason reached out hesitantly, covering her hand with his own. "We still don't have absolute proof of his direct involvement in the explosion itself." "Don't we?" She looked up at him, eyes bright with unshed tears. The pattern is clear, Mason. The altered safety reports, the mysterious meetings before the explosion, the hasty land purchase afterward, the silenced investigation. She drew a shaky breath. My father may not have set the charges himself, but the evidence suggests he orchestrated it all. Before Mason could respond, a knock at the door preceded Parker's head poking into the room. Found what you needed? The editor asked. Then, noting Abigail's distress, added more gently, It's hard reading about it, even after all this time, isn't it, Miss Mercer? 12 good people lost. Abigail composed herself with visible effort. Yes, it's quite affecting, especially now that I'm to marry into a family directly impacted by the tragedy. Parker nodded sympathetically. Town's planning a proper memorial for the 5th anniversary. Committee's meeting at the church tomorrow evening if you two would like to attend. Thank you, Mason said. We'll consider it. As they prepared to leave, Parker added casually, By the way, 2 men were asking about you yesterday, Hayes. Didn't recognize them. City types by the look of their clothes. Wanted to know if you'd been seen in town recently. Mason stiffened, exchanging a quick glance with Abigail. Did they say what they wanted? Claimed they were looking to buy cattle? Parker shrugged. But they didn't strike me as cattlemen. Thought you should know. Thank you, Mason said with genuine gratitude. We appreciate the warning. Outside, as they mounted their horses, Mason kept his voice low. Your father may know you're with me. Or someone is watching Franklin, Abigail suggested. After his accident, they might be checking who visits him. Either possibility was concerning. They rode out of town at a casual pace to avoid drawing attention, but once clear of Silver Creek, Mason led them on a circuitous route back to the ranch, watching carefully for any sign they were being followed. The sun was high overhead when they finally returned to Pine Ridge. Mason immediately checked the property for any signs of intruders, while Abigail prepared a light meal. They found nothing obviously disturbed, but the warning had put them both on edge. We should visit Franklin again tomorrow, Mason said as they ate. If his condition is worsening, we may not have much time to get any additional information from him. Abigail nodded agreement. And we need to secure those documents he gave us. If someone went to the trouble of causing his accident, they might be looking for his evidence. As afternoon faded toward evening, Mason found himself increasingly aware of their isolation at the ranch. What had always felt like peaceful solitude now seemed like vulnerability. If Joseph Mercer had indeed arranged the mine explosion to cover up the gold discovery, what would he do to prevent that truth from coming to light? And what might he do if he discovered his own daughter was helping uncover that truth? As darkness fell, Mason checked and loaded his rifle, placing it near the door. Abigail watched silently from where she sat, recording their findings in her journal. Do you think they'll come here? She asked finally. I don't know, he answered honestly. But I won't be caught unprepared if they do. They worked by lamplight for another hour, organizing their evidence and planning their next steps. The domesticity of the scene, sharing the table, passing documents between them. The comfortable silence of focused work created an intimacy neither had anticipated when this arrangement began. When Abigail finally closed her journal and stood to retire for the night, she paused beside Mason's chair. Thank you, she said softly. For what? For trusting me, for seeing me as more than just Joseph Mercer's daughter. Her voice held a vulnerability he'd not heard before. Few people ever have. Mason looked up at her, struck by how the lamplight softened her features, caught golden highlights in her hair. For a moment, the investigation, the mine, even Rachel's memory seemed to recede, leaving only this unexpected connection between 2 people who had found common purpose. Thank you, he replied, "for proving me right to trust you." Something shifted in her eyes, a moment of recognition perhaps, of the bond forming between them beyond their shared quest for truth. Then she smiled softly and turned toward her room. "Good night, Mason." "Good night, Abigail." Alone in the main room, Mason banked the fire and checked the doors one final time. Tomorrow, they would visit Franklin again, perhaps learn the identity of whoever had placed the explosives at Whispering Pines. One step closer to justice for Rachel and the others who had died. Yet as he climbed the ladder to his loft, Mason found his thoughts dwelling not on the past and its ghosts, but on Abigail Mercer and a future he had never allowed himself to imagine might be possible. The pounding on the front door jolted Mason from sleep before dawn. He grabbed his rifle and descended the loft ladder in swift, silent movements, heart hammering against his ribs. The knocking came again, more insistent. "Hayes, open up! It's Wilson!" Mason recognized the doctor's voice and lowered his rifle, though tension still coiled within him as he unbolted the door. "Doctor." Wilson stood on the porch, hat in hand, his expression grave in the faint light of approaching dawn. "It's Franklin," he said without preamble. "Took a turn in the night. He's asking for you. Says it can't wait." "I'll saddle the horses," Mason replied, already reaching for his coat. "Just yourself, Hayes," Wilson cautioned. "He's barely holding on. Don't know if he'll last till you get there." A soft sound made them both turn. Abigail stood in the hallway doorway, hastily dressed, her hair loose around her shoulders. "I'm coming too," she stated firmly. Wilson looked between them, clearly noting her disheveled appearance and drawing conclusions about their living arrangement. Under other circumstances, Mason might have cared about the impropriety. Now, with Franklin dying, such concerns seemed trivial. "We'll both go," Mason said with finality. "Give us 5 minutes, Doctor." They made record time to Franklin's cabin, arriving just as the eastern sky bloomed with the first pale light of day. The old inspector was exactly as they'd left him, but his complexion had taken on a gray pallor that spoke more clearly than any medical diagnosis. "Thought you might not make it," Franklin rasped as Mason knelt beside his bed. "Need to tell you before I go." "I'm here," Mason assured him gently, clasping the old man's frail hand. "We both are." Franklin's rheumy eyes found Abigail standing behind Mason. "The Mercer girl. Still helping." "Yes," Abigail answered simply, stepping closer. "Whatever you need to say, I want to hear it." The old man studied her face for a long moment, as if making a final assessment of her character. Then he nodded weakly. "In my desk. Secret drawer. Bottom right. Pull the panel. There's a letter." Mason moved to the desk, finding the hidden compartment with careful fingers. Inside lay a sealed envelope yellowed with age. "Read it," Franklin urged, his breathing growing more labored. "Now!" Mason broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. As he read, his expression, hardened jaw clenching visibly. Without a word, he handed the letter to Abigail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, a neat, precise script that documented a payment of $5,000 for special demolition services at the Whispering Pines site. It was dated 2 days before the explosion and signed with a single initial V. "Victoria," Abigail whispered, the blood draining from her face. "My sister." Franklin's hand clutched weakly at the blanket. "Saw her that night. Didn't know who she was then. Recognized her later, in town. Never could prove it. Victoria arranged the explosives." Mason's voice was dangerously quiet. "She caused the disaster that killed 12 people, that killed Rachel. Not alone." Franklin's breath came in shallow gasps now. "Working for Your father. His fading gaze found Abigail. Sorry, girl. Truth's ugly, sometimes. Abigail stood perfectly still, the letter trembling in her hands. How can you be sure it was Victoria? The initial could be anyone. Described her to a sketch artist. Keep looking. Franklin's eyes drifted closed, his voice barely audible. There's more. Always more. Dr. Wilson stepped forward, checking the old man's pulse with practiced fingers. He's going, he said quietly. Not long now. Mason remained kneeling beside the bed, conflict evident in every line of his body. The anger and grief that had driven him for 5 years now had a specific target, not just Joseph Mercer, but his daughter, Victoria. The sister of the woman standing beside him, pale with shock. Franklin's breathing grew increasingly shallow. His lips moved, forming words too faint to hear. Mason leaned closer. Find justice, the old inspector whispered. Not vengeance, difference matters. With those final words, Inspector Franklin slipped away, his weathered face relaxing as his long quest for truth came to an end. Dr. Wilson gently closed the dead man's eyes, then stepped back, allowing Mason a moment of silent farewell. When Mason finally stood, his expression was unreadable emotions locked tightly behind a mask of control. We should let the doctor prepare him, he said, voice rough. There's nothing more we can do here. Outside, the morning sun had fully risen, casting long shadows across the clearing in front of Franklin's cabin. Neither spoke as they mounted their horses for the ride back to Pine Ridge. The letter, now tucked inside Mason's coat pocket, seemed to burn between them like a physical manifestation of the new barrier that had arisen. Victoria Mercer, Abigail's sister, had apparently helped orchestrate the disaster that claimed Rachel Hayes's life. How could either of them move past that revelation? They were halfway back to the ranch when Abigail finally broke the silence. I need to see her handwriting, she said, voice steady, despite the turmoil evident in her eyes, to know for certain if that letter was written by Victoria. Mason glanced at her expression, guarded. Do you doubt Franklin's identification? I doubt everything until I see proof with my own eyes. Abigail met his gaze directly. That's why I'm here. Remember, for the truth, no matter how painful. Something shifted in Mason's expression, a slight softening of the hard lines that had formed since reading Franklin's letter. In my office at the ranch, he said after a moment, I have samples of various Mercer Company correspondence, including some signed by Victoria as your father's representative. The remainder of the ride passed in tense silence, each lost in private thoughts. At the ranch, they moved with wordless efficiency, stabling the horses, entering the house, retrieving the documents from Mason's locked desk drawer. Side by side at the kitchen table, they compared the handwriting on Franklin's letter with Victoria's signatures on various business papers. The similarity was undeniable. The same distinctive curve to the capital letters, the same spacing between words. It's hers, Abigail admitted quietly, tracing her finger over her sister's elegant signature. Victoria wrote this letter arranging for explosives at the mine. Mason watched her closely, searching for signs of denial or defense of family. He found none, only a deep sadness and resolute determination. What do you want to do now? He asked. Abigail looked up, meeting his gaze steadily. What we've been doing all along. Follow the evidence, find the complete truth. Ensure justice for those who died. She paused, then added softly, including your sister. The simple statement delivered without qualification, despite the painful revelation about her own sister, touched something deep within Mason. The wall of suspicion he'd begun rebuilding crumbled as quickly as it had formed. Franklin was right, he said more to himself than to Abigail. The difference between justice and vengeance matters. Yes, it does. Abigail reached across the table hesitantly, covering his hand with her own. And you've been seeking justice all along, Mason, not revenge. He looked down at their hands, hers pale and smooth, against his sun-darkened calloused fingers. Such different lives they'd led, yet here they were bound by shared purpose. We need to find out how deeply Victoria was involved, he said finally, and who else might have participated. There's one way to know for certain. Abigail withdrew her hand, though the warmth of her touch lingered on his skin. We need to confront Victoria directly. Mason's eyebrows rose in surprise. You want to confront your sister, the woman who may have helped kill 12 people? I want the truth from her own lips. Abigail's voice held no hesitation. If Victoria was involved in what happened at Whispering Pines, she should face the consequences, just as my father should. The simple statement, delivered without drama, but with quiet conviction, reinforced what Mason had been discovering since Abigail's arrival. She was a woman of principle, even when those principles came at personal cost. How do you suggest we approach her? He asked. Not at the Mercer estate, Abigail said immediately. My father would ensure we never spoke with her alone. But Victoria regularly visits her friend Mrs. Harrington in town every Wednesday afternoon. Tomorrow. You're suggesting we intercept her there? Abigail nodded. Mrs. Harrington is nearly deaf and takes a nap promptly at 3 o'clock. Victoria often stays in the garden reading or writing letters. We could approach her there. Mason considered the plan, weighing risks against the need for answers. It's dangerous. If your father has people watching for us in town, then we'll need to be careful, Abigail finished for him. But Franklin deserved better than to die with his quest for truth unfinished. Rachel deserved better than to have her death go unpunished. All those families deserve answers. Her quiet determination settled the matter. They would confront Victoria the next day, seeking confirmation of what Franklin's letter already strongly suggested. The remainder of the day passed in careful preparation. They reviewed all their evidence, preparing questions for Victoria, discussing how to approach her without triggering immediate denial. As evening fell, they shared a simple meal, the domesticity of their routine now overlaid with a heightened awareness of tomorrow's confrontation. If Victoria confirms her involvement, Mason said as they cleared the dishes together, what then? Abigail set a plate in the drying rack, her movements deliberate as she considered the question. Then we take everything, Franklin's original report, the geological survey showing the gold seam, Victoria's letter, and her testimony to Judge Rivera in the territorial court. Not the local authorities. Judge Morrison signed off on the altered report. Remember? Abigail shook her head. The local courts are too entangled with my father's influence. Judge Rivera is known for his integrity. He's not beholden to the Mercer family. The practicality of her approach, the clear-eyed assessment of who could and couldn't be trusted, reminded Mason again how valuable an ally Abigail had proven to be. More than an ally, if he was honest with himself. There's something else we should consider, he said quietly. Once we move against your father publicly, there's no going back. Your relationship with your family was damaged beyond repair long ago, she finished for him. I've been the family disappointment since I was old enough to question my father's methods. Even so, this is different. This would make you instrumental in your father's downfall. Abigail was silent for a long moment, staring out the window into the gathering darkness. When my grandmother was dying, she said finally, she made me promise something. She said, remember that the Mercer name was once synonymous with integrity not power. Reclaim that legacy if you can. She turned to face Mason, resolution clear in her eyes. If bringing my father to justice for his crimes is what it takes to honor that promise, then so be it. Some legacies are worth the sacrifice. In the quiet that followed her declaration, something shifted between them, mutual respect deepening into something more profound. They had begun as reluctant allies united by a quest for truth. Now facing the culmination of that quest, they stood together by choice rather than circumstance. As they prepared for bed, the awareness of tomorrow's dangers lent a poignancy to their simple good nights. At the door to her room, Abigail paused. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Mason," she said softly, "I want you to know I don't regret coming here. Finding the truth about Whispering Pines, about my family's role in it, was necessary, no matter how painful." And after, he asked the question slipping out before he could consider its implications. "When this is finished, what then?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Abigail's eyes met his, warm with an emotion neither had acknowledged directly. "I suppose," she said carefully, "that depends on what we both want when the truth is finally known." With that, she entered her room, leaving Mason to ponder her words and the future they might share. Once justice had been served, a future he had not allowed himself to imagine until now. Wednesday dawned clear and cool, a perfect autumn day that belied the tension vibrating through both Mason and Abigail as they prepared for their confrontation with Victoria. They rode toward town, taking a circuitous route, watchful for any sign they were being observed or followed. Silver Creek was busy with its usual Wednesday commerce, farmers bringing produce to market, ranchers purchasing supplies, women gathering at the general store to exchange news and goods. Mason and Abigail separated upon entering town, a precaution they'd agreed upon. He would secure their horses at the livery and approach Mrs. Harrington's house from the rear, while Abigail would walk through town, casually window shopping until the appointed time. At precisely 2:45, Abigail made her way to the neat white house at the edge of town where the elderly Mrs. Harrington resided. As predicted, Victoria's carriage stood outside its driver, dozing in the afternoon sun. Abigail circled around to the garden gate in the rear, where Mason was already waiting, concealed behind a large lilac bush. "She's here," Abigail confirmed in a whisper, joining him in the shadows. "Mrs. Harrington will be taking her nap soon if she hasn't already." Through gaps in the foliage, they could see Victoria seated on a wrought iron bench beneath an apple tree, a book open in her lap, though she seemed more interested in the garden than in reading. At 30, the eldest Mercer daughter remained strikingly beautiful. Her blonde hair arranged in the latest fashion, her blue dress clearly tailored in the city at significant expense. As they watched, the back door opened, and Mrs. Harrington, a tiny woman stooped with age, appeared briefly. "I'll just lie down for my rest, dear," she called to Victoria. "Help yourself to more tea if you'd like." "Thank you, Mrs. Harrington. Enjoy your nap," Victoria replied with practiced courtesy. When the door closed again, Victoria immediately set aside her book and withdrew a small notebook from her reticule, beginning to write with focused intensity. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. Abigail stepped out from behind the lilac, first moving quietly across the grass. "Hello, Victoria." Her sister's head snapped up, shock registering briefly before her features composed themselves into careful neutrality. "Abigail, what on earth are you doing here?" "Looking for answers," Abigail replied simply, stopping a few feet away. "About Whispering Pines." Victoria's expression froze, her fingers tightening almost imperceptibly around her pencil. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." Mason emerged from concealment, moving to stand beside Abigail. "We found the letter you wrote Miss Mercer." arranging for special demolition services at the mine. All color drained from Victoria's face, though she maintained her rigid posture. "You're trespassing," she said coldly. "Both of you. Leave now, or I'll call for assistance." "Inspector Franklin identified you," Abigail continued undeterred. "He saw you at the mine the night before the explosion. He kept evidence, Victoria. Evidence we now have." Something flickered in Victoria's eyes, fear, perhaps, or calculation. She glanced toward the house, but the windows remained empty, Mrs. Harrington presumably already deep in her afternoon nap. "Whatever you think you know," she began, her voice tightly controlled, "you're mistaken. I suggest you leave before you say something that cannot be unsaid." 12 people died in that explosion," Mason said, anger edging his voice despite his efforts at control. "Including my sister Rachel. We have proof of your involvement, Miss Mercer. The only question now is whether you were acting alone or on your father's orders." Victoria's gaze darted between them, assessing, calculating. Then, unexpectedly, her shoulders slumped slightly. "You have no idea what you're meddling with," she said, her voice suddenly tired. "None at all." "Then enlighten us," Abigail urged, taking a step closer. "Tell us what really happened, Victoria." A bitter smile touched Victoria's lips. "You always were determined to know everything, weren't you, little sister? Always poking into matters that didn't concern you." She closed her notebook with deliberate care. "Very well. You want the truth. Sit down. This isn't a short story." Warily, Mason and Abigail seated themselves on the stone garden wall opposite Victoria's bench. The eldest Mercer daughter studied them for a long moment, as if memorizing their faces before beginning. "Father discovered the gold seam at Whispering Pines quite by accident," she said finally. "A geological survey for a different property happened to include data suggesting significant gold deposits under what was thought to be merely a coal operation. The Buchanans had no idea what they were sitting on. So he decided to acquire it by any means necessary," Mason supplied grimly. Victoria's gaze flicked to him, cold and assessing. "Business is rarely straightforward, Mr. Hayes, especially in mining. Father arranged to purchase the property legitimately at first, but Jacob Buchanan refused to sell at any price. He was sentimental about the mine his father had started. So when legitimate means failed, your father turned to criminal ones," Abigail said. A shadow passed over Victoria's face. "Father has never accepted failure as an option. When he wants something, he finds a way to obtain it. By killing 12 innocent people." Mason's voice was dangerously quiet. Victoria flinched, the first genuine emotion she'd displayed. The plan was never to kill anyone. The explosion was supposed to happen during the overnight shift change, when the mine would be empty. Just enough damage to make the operation unprofitable for the Buchanans, forcing them to sell. But something went wrong, Abigail guessed, watching her sister carefully. Everything went wrong. Victoria's composed facade cracked slightly, revealing glimpses of long-suppressed distress. The charges were set incorrectly. The explosion happened during full operation instead of between shifts, and it was much larger than intended. "And you were directly involved," Mason pressed. "Your letter arranged for the explosives." Victoria met his accusing stare with surprising steadiness. "Yes, I wrote the letter. I paid the demolition expert, a man who had worked for Father before on other projects. I was the one Father trusted with the sensitive aspects of his business dealings. You helped cause the explosion that killed 12 people." Abigail said the words heavy with finality. "Including Mason's sister." For the first time, Victoria's composure truly faltered. "I never meant for anyone to die," she whispered. "You have to believe that, Abigail. When I heard about the casualties, when Father acted like it was merely an unfortunate complication," she trailed off, hands twisting in her lap. "That's when I began keeping records, documenting everything. Insurance, perhaps, but also atonement of a kind." Abigail stared at her sister in growing understanding. The anonymous donations to the miners' families after the disaster. "That was you, wasn't it?" Victoria nodded slightly. "Father negotiated settlements with each family, minimal payments, conditioned on their agreement never to question the accident ruling. I supplemented those amounts anonymously. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough." "Why not come forward with the truth?" Mason demanded, unmoved by her apparent remorse. "Why protect your father all these years?" "You don't understand what he's capable of," Victoria said, real fear flickering in her eyes. "What he would do to protect his empire, his legacy, even to his own family." "What do you mean?" Abigail asked. Victoria hesitated, then withdrew a key from her reticule. "There's a locked drawer in my writing desk at home. Inside is a journal documenting everything, every questionable deal, every threat, every cover-up, including Whispering Pines." She held out the key to Abigail. "Take it. Use it, however you see fit." Abigail accepted the key with visible surprise. "Why now, Victoria?" "After 5 years of silence, because I'm leaving," Victoria replied simply. "I've accepted a marriage proposal from a man in San Francisco. I'll be gone by the end of the month, beyond Father's reach." A sad smile touched her lips. "Perhaps beyond his vengeance as well, though I wouldn't wager heavily on that. Running away won't bring back those who died," Mason said coldly. "No, it won't." Victoria met his gaze directly. "Nothing will bring them back, Mr. Hayes. Not my testimony, not my imprisonment, not even my death. But perhaps the truth can finally be told, and some measure of justice done." The garden fell silent, save for the distant chirping of birds. The three sat in this tableau of revelation and reckoning, Victoria, with the weary posture of someone finally unburdened of a heavy secret, Mason struggling visibly with his response to her confession, and Abigail caught between loyalty to her newfound ally and the complicated emotions evoked by her sister's unexpected vulnerability. "What about Mother?" Abigail asked finally. "How much does she know about Father's activities?" Victoria's expression softened slightly. "Mother has always known more than she acknowledges even to herself. It's her way of surviving. But she's been protecting you, Abigail. Why do you think Father hasn't taken more direct action to silence your inconvenient questions over the years?" Abigail absorbed this information with visible surprise. "And Sophia? Sophia sees what benefits her position and blinds herself to the rest." Victoria's assessment was dispassionate. "She'll stand with Father regardless of what evidence you present." A clock inside the house chimed 3, breaking the tension momentarily. Victoria glanced toward the windows, then rose from the bench. "Mrs. Harrington will wake soon," she said, smoothing her skirts with practiced grace. "You should go before you're seen. Her maid gossips incessantly." Mason stood as well, his expression still hard. "This isn't finished, Miss Mercer. What you've admitted to what you helped your father do, it can't be erased by simply handing over a key and expressing regret." "I'm well aware of that, Mr. Hayes." Victoria's aristocratic composure had returned, though her eyes remained haunted. "I expect no forgiveness, only perhaps understanding that we are sometimes shaped by forces beyond our control." "There's always a choice," he countered firmly. Yes, she agreed softly. And I made mine 5 years ago. Now I'm making another. She turned to Abigail. The journal contains everything you'll need to bring father to justice. Names, dates, amounts paid. Use it wisely, little sister. And be careful. He won't surrender his empire without a fight. With that warning, Victoria gathered her belongings and walked with measured steps toward the house, the perfect picture of a society lady concluding a social call. Only the slight trembling of her hands betrayed the significance of what had just transpired. Mason and Abigail slipped out through the garden gate, making their way separately back toward the livery stable where they'd arranged to meet. Once reunited, they mounted their horses and rode out of Silver Creek in thoughtful silence, each processing Victoria's unexpected confession and the key that now rested in Abigail's pocket. They were halfway back to Pine Ridge when Mason finally spoke. "Do you believe her about not intending for anyone to die?" Abigail considered the question carefully. "I believe she didn't anticipate the consequences of her actions. Whether that absolves her of responsibility is another matter entirely." "It doesn't bring Rachel back," Mason said quietly. "Or the others who died." "No," Abigail agreed, her voice gentle with understanding of his pain. "Nothing can do that. But Victoria's journal might help ensure your sister didn't die in vain. If it contains what she claims, it could bring my father to justice for all his crimes, not just Whispering Pines." Mason studied her profile as they rode side by side, noting the determination in her expression, despite the emotional toll of confronting her sister's guilt. "You're remarkable, Abigail Mercer," he said unexpectedly. "Most people would be defending their family, not seeking to expose them." A faint blush colored her cheeks at the compliment. "Truth matters more than family loyalty when that loyalty requires complicity in wrongdoing," she replied simply. They rode on the pine ridge that gave Mason's ranch its name, appearing on the horizon. The familiar sight, which had always represented sanctuary to Mason, now seemed to offer something more possibility, perhaps. A future beyond the quest for justice that had consumed him for 5 years. "What will you do?" he asked as they approached the ranch. "After this is finished, I mean." Abigail didn't pretend to misunderstand his question. "I haven't thought that far ahead," she admitted. "Until recently, I couldn't imagine a life beyond the constraints of being Joseph Mercer's troublesome daughter. And now?" She turned to him, the setting sun gilding her profile. "Now I can imagine many possibilities I couldn't before." The simple statement, delivered without coquetry or calculation, resonated deeply with Mason. Before he could respond, however, his attention was caught by something unusual ahead, a plume of dust rising from the direction of his ranch house. "Riders," he said tersely, spurring his horse forward, "coming from the ranch." They crested a small rise in time to see 2 men on horseback departing from the direction of Pine Ridge. Even at a distance, their city clothes and purposeful pace marked them as out of place in the rural landscape. "The men Parker mentioned," Abigail guessed, "the ones asking about you in town." Mason nodded grimly. "Let's find out what they wanted." They approached the ranch, cautiously alert for any sign of danger. Nothing appeared disturbed outside. The animals were calm, the outbuildings intact. Only when they entered the house did they discover evidence of intrusion, drawers pulled open, papers scattered, Mason's lockbox pried apart, its contents missing. "Franklin's documents," Mason confirmed after a quick assessment. "The original inspection report, the geological survey, everything. Gone." Abigail surveyed the disorder with growing alarm. "They knew exactly what they were looking for. Someone told them what we had and where to find it." "Victoria," Mason suggested, anger evident in his voice. A convenient way to eliminate evidence before giving us a key to more, possibly, Abigail acknowledged. Or my father could have other sources of information. People in town who noticed our visits to Franklin, perhaps. Mason ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Without those documents, it's our word against your father's and Victoria's. Even with her journal, if we can retrieve it. We have my journal, Abigail interrupted, moving quickly to her room. And something they couldn't have known about. She returned moments later with her leather-bound journal, and to Mason's surprise, several folded pages of official-looking documents. "What are those?" he asked. "Copies," Abigail explained, spreading them on the table. "I made duplicate notes of Franklin's most important documents yesterday while you were tending the cattle. Not exact reproductions, but the essential information is here: dates, names, amounts." Mason stared at her in amazement, hope rekindling. "Abigail, that's brilliant," she offered a small smile. "My grandmother taught me never to trust a single copy of anything important, especially when powerful interests might prefer it destroyed." "Still, without the originals, it's not as strong a case," Mason noted, examining her careful notes. "We need Victoria's journal now more than ever." "Agreed." Abigail's expression grew determined. "And we need to move quickly before my father discovers what Victoria has done, if he hasn't already." They spent the next hour formulating a plan. Victoria's key provided access to crucial evidence, but retrieving the journal from the Mercer estate presented significant challenges. The mansion was well-staffed, with Joseph Mercer often working from his study. Direct entry during daylight would be impossible. "There's a servant's entrance on the east side," Abigail explained, sketching a rough floor plan. "It leads to a back staircase near Victoria's rooms. The staff use it primarily in the morning and evening. During mid-afternoon, it's usually deserted." "You're suggesting we simply walk into your father's house and take the journal?" Mason asked skeptically. "I'm suggesting I walk in," Abigail corrected. "I still have my key and no one would question my presence there. You can wait with the horses at the grove of trees beyond the east garden." Mason shook his head firmly. "Too dangerous. Your father could be there, or whoever ransacked my house. My father has a standing meeting with his bank associates every Thursday afternoon in town. Tomorrow." Abigail's expression was resolute. "It's our best opportunity." Despite his misgivings, Mason had to acknowledge the logic of her plan. Still, the idea of Abigail entering the Mercer estate alone, essentially walking into the lion's den, filled him with dread. "If anything seems wrong, anything at all, you leave immediately," he insisted. "The journal isn't worth your safety." "I'll be careful," she promised, touched by his concern. They spent the remainder of the evening restoring order to the ransacked house and preparing for the next day's mission. As night fell, an unspoken awareness of increased danger drew them closer together physically and emotionally. They worked side by side, ate dinner with knees nearly touching beneath the small table, and spoke in low, intimate tones despite being alone in the house. When they finally retired for the night, Mason found sleep elusive. The thought of Abigail returning to the Mercer estate even briefly stirred a protective instinct he hadn't felt since Rachel's death. Sometime past midnight he heard soft footsteps and looked down from his loft to see Abigail moving restlessly through the main room, apparently unable to sleep as well. "Abigail," he called softly. She looked up moonlight from the window, silvering her loose hair and white nightdress. "I'm sorry if I woke you." "You didn't." Mason descended the ladder, pulling on his shirt as he joined her. "Couldn't sleep either." She shook her head, moving to stand by the window. "I keep thinking about Victoria, about choices and consequences, about what might have been if she'd made different decisions 5 years ago. Mason stood beside her close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her body, yet careful not to touch her, acutely aware of their state of undress and the intimacy of the midnight hour. "We can't change the past," he said gently. "Only how we respond to it now." "I know." Abigail turned to face him, her expression solemn in the moonlight. "But I keep wondering if I'm doing the right thing. Exposing my father's crimes will destroy my family, Mason. Not just him, but all of us. The Mercer name will be ruined forever." "Does that matter more than justice for those who died?" he asked, quietly without judgment. "No," she answered without hesitation. "But it doesn't make the choice any easier." She looked down, her next words barely audible. "Or the consequences any less lonely." The vulnerability in her admission, the acknowledgement of the personal cost she faced, moved Mason deeply. Without conscious thought, he reached for her hand, enveloping it in his own. "You won't be alone, Abigail," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Whatever happens, whatever comes after, if you want, you'll have me." She looked up, her eyes wide with surprise at the implication of his words. "Mason." "I didn't plan this," he continued, needing her to understand. "When I arranged for you to come here, I thought only of finding justice for Rachel. I never expected." He trailed off, struggling to articulate the profound shift in his feelings. "Neither did I," Abigail admitted softly. "But here we are." "Here we are," he echoed, suddenly acutely aware of how close they stood, of her hand warm within his, of the moonlight catching golden highlights in her hair. Time seemed suspended as they regarded one another, the air between them charged with unspoken possibility. Then, with the gentle inevitability of dawn following night, Mason leaned forward and kissed her. It was a tender kiss, tentative at first, then deepening as Abigail responded, her free hand coming to rest against his chest. When they finally parted, both were breathing unevenly, the world around them transformed by this crossing of a threshold neither had anticipated. "I should—" Abigail gestured vaguely toward her room, though she made no move to leave. "Stay," Mason said simply, the single word carrying multiple meanings. "Just to talk. The night is long, and tomorrow brings its own challenges." They settled on the small sofa before the fireplace, where Mason rekindled the dying embers. Side by side in the gentle glow, they spoke of things long held private. Mason, of his parents' early deaths, of raising Rachel alone, of dreams deferred by tragedy. Abigail, of her grandmother's influence, of small rebellions against her father's authority, of books and ideas that had shaped her worldview. Somewhere in the quiet exchange of confidences, Abigail's head came to rest against Mason's shoulder, his arm encircling her protectively. Eventually, her breathing deepened and slowed as she drifted into sleep, her body relaxing trustingly against his. Mason remained awake, watching the play of firelight across her peaceful features. The realization settled within him, profound in its simplicity. Whatever began as a quest for justice had transformed into something equally powerful, something with the potential to heal rather than simply avenge. As dawn's first light crept through the windows, Mason gently woke Abigail. They shared a moment of shy acknowledgement of their changed relationship before separating to prepare for the day ahead, a day that would determine whether justice for the past might open the door to a future neither had dared imagine until now. The Mercer mansion looked exactly as it had when Abigail left a week ago, imposing, immaculate and coldly beautiful against the autumn landscape. Yet returning now with all she had discovered about her family's crimes, the house seemed almost sinister, its elegant facade concealing dark secrets within. As planned, Mason waited with the horses in a grove of trees beyond the east garden, while Abigail approached the servants' entrance alone. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but her hands remained steady as she unlocked the door with her old key. The familiar scent of beeswax polish and dried flowers greeted her as she slipped inside, closing the door silently behind her. The house was quiet in the mid-afternoon lull. Abigail moved swiftly up the back staircase, avoiding the main halls where she might encounter staff. Victoria's rooms were located in the east wing overlooking the garden, a location that would allow Mason to maintain visual contact with that section of the house while he waited. Reaching Victoria's door without incident, Abigail used the key her sister had provided. It turned smoothly in the lock, allowing her entry into Victoria's private sitting room. The space reflected her sister's refined taste. Everything elegant, coordinated, and meticulously arranged. The writing desk stood beneath the window, its polished surface bearing a silver inkwell and carefully aligned stationery. Abigail moved quickly to the desk, locating the locked drawer Victoria had described. The key fit perfectly, and the drawer opened to reveal a leather-bound journal similar to Abigail's own, though more elaborate in its binding. She removed it carefully, confirming the contents with a quick glance. Pages of Victoria's precise handwriting, documenting dates, transactions, and names, including several entries clearly marked Whispering Pines. Relief flooded through her. The journal existed exactly as Victoria had claimed. They now had the evidence needed to bring her father to justice. Abigail tucked the journal securely inside her coat, relocked the empty drawer, and turned to leave. The sound of the bedroom door opening froze her in place. "I wondered if you'd come," Eleanor Mercer said softly, closing the door behind her. "Mother." Abigail gasped instinctively, pressing a hand against her coat where Victoria's journal lay hidden. Eleanor stood perfectly composed in a dove-gray afternoon dress, her silver-streaked blonde hair arranged immaculately as always. Yet something in her expression seemed different. A tension, perhaps, or a resolve Abigail had rarely observed in her usually compliant mother. "Victoria told me she gave you her key." Eleanor continued, moving further into the room. "I've been watching for you since yesterday." Abigail's mind raced, calculating escape routes and explanations. "I was just seeking evidence about Whispering Pines," Eleanor finished for her. "I know, Abigail. I've always known more than you realize." The simple statement, delivered without accusation, left Abigail momentarily speechless. She studied her mother's face, searching for anger or betrayal, finding instead a complex mixture of resignation and determination. "How much do you know?" Abigail asked carefully. "Everything." Eleanor moved to the window, glancing briefly toward the grove where Mason waited. "About the gold seam, about your father's arrangement with Victoria to create a controlled accident at the mine, about the 12 people who died when that accident went terribly wrong. You knew all this and said nothing." Abigail couldn't keep the shock from her voice. Eleanor turned back to face her daughter, unexpected steel in her gaze. "I've said nothing about many things over the years, Abigail. It was the price of protecting what mattered most to me." "The Mercer name, father's business empire," Abigail challenged. "You," Eleanor replied simply. "And Victoria. Even Sophia, though she rarely needed my intervention. Every time your father's anger at your meddling reached dangerous levels, I was the one who deflected it. Every time Victoria's guilt threatened to overwhelm her into confession, I was the one who steadied her." Abigail struggled to reconcile this image of her mother as a behind-the-scenes protector with the passive, decorative figure she had always perceived. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because it's ending," Eleanor said with quiet finality. "All of it. Victoria is leaving. You've found your own path. And she straightened her shoulders slightly. I've finally found my courage. From a hidden pocket in her skirts, Eleanor withdrew a folded document and held it out to Abigail. This is the original deed to the Whispering Pines property. Note the mineral rights section where gold deposits are specifically documented, then concealed in the final filing. Abigail accepted the paper with trembling fingers. Mother, this is proof of deliberate fraud. How did you get this? I've kept my own records over the years. A ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. Your grandmother's influence, perhaps? She always said that knowledge protected women in a world where we had little official power. Does father know you have this? No, just as he doesn't know about the separate accounts I've maintained or the evidence I've gathered regarding his more questionable business practices. Eleanor's gaze was steady, revealing a strength Abigail had never fully recognized. He's always underestimated me, considered me merely decorative. It was safer that way. The revelation of her mother's secret strength, her quiet resistance within the confines of her marriage, struck Abigail profoundly. She had judged Eleanor as weak complicit through inaction, when in reality she had been playing a long, careful game of her own. What happens now? Abigail asked, overwhelmed by this unexpected ally. Now you take Victoria's journal and the deed, and you do what your grandmother would have wanted: restore integrity to the Mercer name, even if it means dismantling the empire your father built. Eleanor straightened a small figurine on Victoria's desk, the habitual gesture at odds with the momentous nature of their conversation. Your father will be in town until evening. You should go before he returns. Come with me, Abigail urged suddenly. You don't have to stay here anymore. Eleanor shook her head gently. My place is here, Abigail. Someone must manage the aftermath, whatever it may be. He'll know you helped me when the deed becomes public. Yes, Eleanor acknowledged calmly, but after 35 years of marriage, I believe I've earned the right to finally speak my truth, don't you? The quiet dignity in her mother's stance, the culmination of decades of silent endurance and careful planning, moved Abigail deeply. She stepped forward and embraced Eleanor, feeling her mother's arms tighten around her with surprising strength. Be happy, Abigail, Eleanor whispered. Find a life built on honesty, not power. That's all I've ever wanted for you. I will, Abigail promised, tears threatening. Thank you, Mother, for everything. They separated, each composing herself with the practiced control that generations of Mercer women had perfected. Eleanor moved to the door, checking that the hallway remained clear. Go now, she urged, and give Mason Hayes my regards. Tell him. She paused, something wistful crossing her features. Tell him I hope he finds peace now that the truth about his sister's death will finally be known. With a final shared glance of understanding, Abigail slipped out of Victoria's room and made her way back down the servants' staircase. The journey out of the house seemed both eternal and instantaneous, her mind still processing the revelations about her mother's secret strength and unexpected alliance. When she finally reached the grove where Mason waited anxiously with the horses, the combined weight of Victoria's journal and the property deed seemed to burn against her side, physical manifestations of truth, long concealed, soon to be revealed to the world. You have it? Mason asked immediately, scanning her face with concern. Yes, Abigail confirmed, patting her coat. And more. My mother was there. She gave me additional evidence. She's known everything all along, Mason, and she's been protecting us in her own way. His eyebrows rose in surprise, but practical concerns took precedence over discussion. We should leave quickly. Your father is in town until evening. Abigail finished mounting her horse with his assistance. But you're right. We should go now. They rode away from the Mercer estate at a measured pace, avoiding the main road in favor of less traveled paths through the countryside. Their destination was the territorial courthouse in Laramie, where Judge Rivera presided a full day's journey that would require an overnight stop along the way. As the Mercer mansion receded behind them, Abigail felt a complex mixture of emotions, grief for the family relationships that would be forever altered by her actions, determination to see justice done for those who had died at Whispering Pines, and a surprising sense of liberation, as if long-carried weights were finally being set down. Beside her, Mason rode in thoughtful silence, occasionally glancing her way with an expression that spoke of his own complicated feelings, the culmination of a 5-year quest for truth, mingled with emerging hopes for a future beyond vengeance. "Are you all right?" he asked eventually, as they paused to rest the horses at a stream crossing. Abigail considered the question carefully. "I'm not sure 'all right' is the correct term for what I'm feeling," she admitted, "but I know this is the right path, difficult as it may be." Mason dismounted and helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering slightly at her waist. The gesture reminded her of their changed relationship, of the kiss they had shared in the moonlight of possibilities that had seemed impossible just days ago. "What happens after we reach Judge Rivera?" she asked, giving voice to the question that had hovered between them since the previous night. "After all of this is finished." Mason's expression softened, his eyes meeting hers with newfound openness. "I've been thinking about that," he said quietly. "For 5 years, justice for Rachel has been my only purpose. I never allowed myself to consider what might come after." "And now," Abigail prompted gently, "now I find myself thinking about rebuilding rather than just avenging, about healing instead of only justice." His hands found hers strong and warm. "About a future that might include more than memories and regrets." The simple words, spoken without flowery declarations or grand promises, resonated deeply with Abigail. They reflected her own evolution from the constrained daughter of Joseph Mercer to a woman charting her own course based on principle rather than expedience. "I would like that," she replied softly. "A future focused on building something worthwhile rather than merely opposing what's wrong." Something shifted in Mason's expression, a lightening as if a burden had been set aside. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently against hers, in a gesture of connection more intimate than a kiss. "Whatever comes next," he murmured, "we'll face it together." The promise hung between them, simple yet profound. As they remounted and continued their journey toward Laramie and Judge Rivera, the pine ridge that had witnessed so much pain and loss faded behind them. Ahead lay uncertainty, challenge, and the difficult work of justice. But for the first time in years, both Abigail Mercer and Mason Hayes rode toward the future with hope, rather than merely determination, a hope born from the shared belief that truth, once finally unearthed, might become the foundation for something new to grow. Under the vast Wyoming sky, with mountains etched against the horizon and autumn sunlight gilding the landscape, they rode side by side toward whatever awaited them, no longer driven solely by the ghosts of the past, but drawn forward by possibilities yet to unfold. Behind them, the tall pines that had stood witness to tragedy and deception now seemed to whisper of resilience and renewal, a fitting monument to both those lost and those who remained, to honor their memory through lives well lived. And in that moment, the oath Mason had made beneath those pines 5 years ago to find the truth about his sister's death transformed into something equally sacred, but fundamentally different, a promise to build a future worthy of all that had been sacrificed to reach this point of beginning again.